Devil's Hole itself contains a rare species of cavefish found nowhere else in the world, at least nowhere that marine biologists are aware of. It is reported that at least 2 divers disappeared in this apparently bottomless aqua cave some years ago, leading officials to put the cave under government protection by making it an extension of Death Valley National Monument, much of which lies well below sea level. The existence of, or the possibility of the existence of, such underground seas beneath the California-Nevada regions seems to be supported by other accounts. During the Shaver Mystery years, Ray Palmer received a letter from a reader describing Earl Door's cave. This letter stated that 3 Paiute Indian boys had, with the help of a treasure map, extracted $50,000 worth of gold from these caverns, which they kept in the bank at Needles, California. Their project was halted when one of the boys slipped from one of the lowest rock tiers and died. We will now quote from William R. Halliday's professional observations of the claims made in Door's affidavit, as they appear in his book Adventure is Underground. What is the gimmick? This was probably the question in the mind of every reader of the California Mining Journal when this affidavit appeared in its November 1940 issue. The question still arises whenever a caver first hears the remarkable story of this still more remarkable cave. Furthermore, the answers to the other obvious questions are not those which might be anticipated. Is this just an imaginary cave? No, the cave certainly exists. I have been in it. Did Door keep its location secret? No. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of people know its exact location, high on the side of Kokowif Peak in the Mojave Desert. Has anyone tried to find this river of gold? Yes, indeed. The prosperous Crystal Cave Mining Corporation owns the property. Then what is the gimmick? That's quite a tale. The beginnings of the story of the Cave of Gold are shrouded in the mists of the minds of old-timers. For a long time, prowling prospectors have known of the existence of the wide mouth of a deep cavern on the limestone flank of a peak which forms part of the east face of Ivanpah Valley, Kokowif Peak. Even though only 4 miles by dirt road from the highway between Los Angeles and Las Vegas, the area was so desolate that, in the 1920s, weeks might elapse without the passing of more than an occasional prospector and his burro. The opening of the cavern was several feet in diameter and the cave was obviously much larger farther down. There were local stories that it was bottomless, although it took only a few seconds for a rock to strike bottom. Then someone found a narrow crack leading to another cave, high on the east face of the peak. Maybe it was Door. The stories vary. One version repeats the common story of 2 Indians with a treasure map, which in this case was supposed to have showed the entrance to the cave. Door was well known in the area, having a claim across the valley, several miles southwest of Kokowif Peak. Like any experienced prospector, he certainly prowled every ledge of the area. In any event, the new cave seemed even deeper than Kokowif Cave. Like at least 7 other caves in California, it eventually became known as Crystal Cave. Later, in 1934, another old prospector, Pete Ressler, was resting near the bottom of the southwest slope of the barren peak. He idly tossed a rock into a crack. To his surprise, it rattled back and forth for a long time until the sound died away into the depths. He strapped his load on his bra and headed for Mountain Pass Station for dynamite. "What do you think it is, Pete?" the men at the station asked him. "Quinsab." He shrugged. Pete's Spanish, however, was horrible. It sounded like Kinsabi or Kinsab, and this name stuck to the cave he dynamited open. It wasn't much of a cave. It slanted downward, but was filled with rubble from the dynamite blast. Branton to a level not far below the entrance. Old Pete dropped out of the story. Door is the main character. Door must have been a strange person. No one else was particularly interested in the caves, but soon he was telling of an enormous cavern into which he was gradually making his way, trip after trip. The main part of the cave was a series of vertical drops from one small chamber to another. In several areas there were small, dry pools which contained sharp little crystals. From one of the small rooms a tight tunnel led a relatively short distance to a huge cavern containing a chasm 3,000 feet deep. He told of a stalactite 1,500 feet long. Note, both Kokowif and Door peaks are near the SW flank of the Ivanpah MTS, just south of Highway 91. Door alleged that he and his engineer, following the upper rock tiers, discovered a huge cataract or waterfall cascading down the side of the canyon below what they judged to be Door Peak. They allegedly followed the upper shelves for 8 miles. According to a map of the caves drawn by Herman Wallace Jr., under the personal instruction and supervision of Earl Door, The length of the stalactite was given at only 500 feet long, although this would still make it the largest known stalactite in the world at this writing, and was located adjacent to the underground waterfall which flowed into the underground river at the bottom of the canyon as one of its many tributaries. Branton. The cavern went on for miles. He had walked to the brink of the chasm, but had not found a way to its bottom. There were places where air came into the cavern, so other caves on the peak must open into it. And there ought to be an entrance somewhere on his claim, too. That was the direction the cave headed. Before long Dora was claiming to have found a way down the wall of the subterranean canyon. Down below the wonders were even greater. He had found great deposits of placer gold. By this time he had the other old-timers half convinced. Still, they weren't going into that awful-looking hole for all the gold in the United States Mint. One day in 1928 Dora again told his friends that he was going into the cave for another trip. 2 days passed, 3, 4. His friends became worried. Gold would not tempt them to go into the cave, but they were his friends and the code of the desert is stern. Dora might be trapped there, hurt, dying. A rescue party climbed to the mouth of the cave, where Dora's ropes were still fixed. Hardly had they all entered the cave when they met a raging Dora they hardly know. Although disheveled and wild-eyed, he was obviously in no need of rescuing. Nervously they shrank away from his needless fury. Had he gone mad from his long stay underground? More likely it was the dreaded gold fever which has affected the minds of men throughout the centuries and has often motivated them to acts of irrational cruelty. Branton, they were trying to help him, yet he was accusing them of trying to steal his gold. Before they quite understood, they felt the dull impact of a heavy charge of dynamite. Then Dora calmed down. "You'll never get it now," he smirked. That blast finished the tunnel to the river of gold. Interesting note, Halliday himself claims to have seen within this cave, along with several National Speleological Society or NSS members, the name of Dora written in black miner's lampshade near what appeared to be a black line left by a dynamite fuse, below which was a plugged area of shattered rock. Branton, we do not know whether Dora was ever convinced that his friends were only trying to rescue him. For several years he was a familiar figure in the Mojave Desert. Continually he attempted to persuade people to run a tunnel into the Cave of Gold from the lower slopes of Kokowif Peak. He would go shares with them. If they were willing to pay for the tunnel, they could have part of the profits. On this basis few investors were willing to consider the project. Finally, however, a small group headed by a Los Angeles capitalist was willing to speculate on Dora's proposition. First, they tried the easy expedients. Kinsap Cave was the most accessible. Dora thought it connected with the Great Chasm. They installed an inclined railway track and began to remove the rubble which filled it. Before long they had quite a respectable cave, 125 feet deep, but the air in it was completely stagnant. Over Dora's protests, they abandoned the attempt. If there was an entrance to the Great Cavern from Kinsap, it was too deep to bother with, at least until all easier possibilities had been investigated. Next they turned their attention to Kokowif Cave, the first cavern discovered on the peak. A road was built to a nearby ledge and a short tunnel was drilled, connecting the bottom of the cavern to the surface of the peak. Again, much rubble was removed without encountering the true bottom. Operations were in full swing when someone discovered a mineral vein in the wall of the peak a few dozen yards from the tunnel. It was zinc, and high-grade ore. Because of the war, zinc was at a premium. The Crystal Cave Mining Company promptly went into the zinc business. Dora was disgusted. He abandoned the project. Occasionally someone would hear of him, still telling his story of prowling the hills near his old claim, still seeking another entrance to the Cave of Gold. According to Sasquatch researcher Virginia Lewis Swanson, Devil's Hole, in Death Valley National Monument, Nebraska of Death Valley Junction, California, has been the scene of at least one disappearance. According to Swanson, 2 boys entered the cave several years ago and were never seen again. Navy scuba divers were lowered on cables and reported seeing a large river which roared up from below, flowing across a wide expanse. They could not estimate its depth because of a myriad of colonnades of black rock through which the river flowed before plunging once again down an abyss. The cave is somewhere near Devil's Hole, which is still open to public view, although fenced in, and was allegedly sealed shortly after the disappearance. It is interesting that Vincent Bugliosi, in his book Helter Skelter, pages 232-233, 236, refers to Charles Manson, who believed that his mission was to start a race war called Helter Skelter, then hide with his so-called family in an underground area near the Mojave Desert called the Bottomless Pit, and then emerge after the war was over and rule the world. One version states that the Manson family had met with strange people out in the Mojave Desert. Was he programmed? Manson was also convinced that he was Adolf Hitler's illegitimate son. One interesting bit of information was related by Robert K. Newkirk, in a letter in Amazing Stories magazine, April 1949 issue, p. 140, stating that Northern California's Clear Lake has many underground caverns that we know have no endings and others that run to SF Bay. Another anomalous account was related by Jack Peterson in a letter in Shavertron, issue No. 14, describing the writer's own experience near June Lake, California, where he allegedly observed a small humanoid being, a gray, coming out of a strange cone-shaped machine which emerged from the depths of the earth. The alien then re-entered the craft, following which its machine disappeared back the way it had come. Turning for a moment from the subject of subterranean activity, we once again turn our sights toward the stars. Those who have been involved with research into UFOs, underground bases, and secret governments for any length of time will realize just how interconnected aerial, subsurface and social phenomena actually is behind the scenes. For instance, Forrest Crawford's account of the recovery of a craft from Tau Ceti also involved underground bases and transportation systems, as well as top-secret government activity. In addition to Crawford's account, we have a corroborating report which appeared in the UFO Encyclopedia, by John Spencer, Avon Books. 1993. Under the heading Dr. Otto Struve, we read how this astrophysicist assisted Frank Drake in establishing Project Ozma, and its very mysterious conclusion. The project began its search by focusing on the star Tau Ceti. According to claims made at the time, as soon as the project got underway, strong intelligent signals were picked up, leaving all the scientists stunned. Abruptly, Dr. Struve then declared Project Ozma had been shut down, and commented that there was no sensible purpose for listening to messages from another world. Note, or, was this merely an excuse used by the secret government to keep the project and its findings secret? It would seem that Frank Drake, and Dr. Struve for that matter, has or had some connection with the Illuminati, as the Illuminati usually does not allow someone of Drake's influence, for instance, to operate with impunity. Usually people of such influence in economics, media, science, education, religion and politics are either bought off or blacklisted. Frank Drake, with his influence within the underground bases and disk recovery operations, is very obviously not on the Illuminati's blacklist. Branton, back to the underground bases, UFOs, etc. Jimmy Ward, in a letter submitted to Gray Barker's newsletter, August 1982, No. 16 issue, referred to an announcement made by the Canadian Research Council in 1942 of plans for constructing a vast underground complex to be built by Avra Corporation, which was to cover an area of about 75 square miles in the region between British Columbia and Alberta, bordering on the state of Washington on the south, and the Peace River District on the north. No further word of the project has been released. Leslie Watkins, in his book Alternative 003 single quote, first published in London, reprinted by Avon Books, New York, 1978. 239 pages, quotes from an interview with a government official who told of the government's knowledge of entire ancient cities, linked by an elaborate complex of tunnels, far below the surface of the earth, which were lighted by a strange greenish luminescence, and the remains of which have been found under many parts of the world. There have been several documented cases of mysterious disappearances of persons in connection with subsurface and aerial phenomena. One such account involves the ancient Greek Temple of Apollo, in Hierapolis, now Pamukkale, Turkey. This city was once part of the ancient Grecian Empire, which covered an extensive area in and around the Mediterranean Sea. One article which appeared in the January 1989 issue of Omni magazine, referred to strange disappearances which had taken place in a cavern adjacent these ancient temple ruins. The article quoted from the writings of the ancient Greek philosopher Strabo, who lived between 63 before Christ and 24 AD, to the effect that animals would often enter the cave and never return. Also, many people throughout history who went past the mouth of the cave never returned. The article also quoted one Sheldon Aronson, a professor of microbiology at Queen's College, New York, who told Omni that several Australian students had entered the cave and disappeared just a few days before his visit in 1987. Sheldon stated, the Turkish government put iron bars over the opening to prevent other people from ever going in. As far as we knew, The Australians were never seen again. According to the article, the Greeks believed that the cavern was an opening into the land of the dead ruled by the gods of the underworld. As for the possibility of an underground subterranean world, scientists tell us that the lowest depths of the Earth, upper and lower mantles, contain temperature and pressure extremes so great that physical life could not possibly exist there. Some however believe that there is evidence for the existence of a vast global network of crustal geothermal and hydrothermal cavities, some of these having been connected to the ancient deluge wherein the fountains of the Great Deep were broken up. This allegedly occurred as magma heated stratas of subterranean water-filled caverns, brought to enormous pressures by an expanding and overheated mantle, suddenly burst through the crust. General 711, like a pressure boiler of enormous proportions suddenly splitting its seams. Looking at a map of the ocean floors, one can see what seems to be a seam, similar to the seams of a baseball, which in ancient times apparently split or ripped its way around the entire planet. These seams are known as rifts in the ocean floor. Some have claimed that the underlying basaltic rock layers within these ancient and gigantic global ecosystems were dissolved into these global subterranean reservoirs as their temperatures and pressures increased. Eventually the pressure became so great that at the weakest point this global layer of mineralized water broke through, and the tear made its way around the world at an incredible rate. It is not difficult to imagine that such a cataclysm may have caused the sinking of ancient land masses as the underlying mega-aquifers emptied out and the overlying layers lost their support. Vast amounts of this overheated water, which had previously been dissolving the basaltic rock layers surrounding it, exploded to the surface, thus explaining why the oceans now contain a large percentage of salt content. These underlying chambers, many of which collapsed yet many of which apparently remained intact, are believed to exist throughout the moho and crustal regions of the planet, just above the upper mantle. This Mahorvisic discontinuity, or boundary point between the upper crust and lower mantle, is on the average a dozen or so miles below the surface, or from a few miles below the ocean trenches to a few dozen miles below large mountain ranges. So it is possible that caverns of immense extent, containing life-supporting conditions, may conceivably exist at depths of 40-50 miles, especially under the larger mountain ranges. Below that, beyond the moho, the pressure and temperature extremes would make physical life unbearable, if not impossible. Other higher-level cavities created through a geoseismic activity may also exist, cavities which may dwarf the Flint Ridge Mammoth Caves of Kentucky or New Mexico's Carlsbad La Cogula cavern systems. It is suggested that these may contain conditions sufficient to support physical life. That is air, water, subterranean flora and fauna, and perhaps even electromagnetically induced illumination diffused throughout the underground atmosphere through a phenomena somewhat similar to the effect produced by the aurora borealis or northern lights. In this case it has been suggested that powerful electromagnetic currents moving through the Earth and interacting with the underground atmosphere may account for the diffuse twilight illumination permeating the underground atmosphere, as has been described in various accounts of those who claim to have managed to find their way into the more extensive and deeper cavern systems. There have been several accounts concerning individuals who have encountered human beings, some who spoke the native language and others who spoke a language entirely foreign, within deep underground tunnels and caverns. There are many such cases, but we will concern ourselves with only one of these at this point and will reserve the others for later in the text. An incident which may be one of the most well-known and most well-documented accounts of this type, sometime during the 12th century, a monastic chronicler in England by the name of Gervase of Tilbury recorded a strange account of two children who suddenly appeared near a small town near Bury St Edmunds, England. The account was also recorded in the writings of several other chroniclers who lived at the time or sometime afterwards. These include William of Newbury, Historia Rerum Anglicarum, written in Yorkshire, England 1136 to 1198, Abbot Ralph of Coggeshall, Chronicon Anglicarum, and also the chroniclers Giraldus Cambrensis and Walsingham. The account was more recently related in Flying Saucers Uncensored, by Harold T. Wilkins, Citadel Press. New York, 1955. Pages 97-98. From their combined accounts we can piece together the following bizarre story, which the chroniclers swore to be true. One warm, sunny day in the 12th century, some farmers and other residents of the small town of Wolf Pits, England, some 7 miles distant from the larger village of Bury St Edmunds, were startled to see two young children wandering around, as if disoriented, in some ancient pits or trenches known to the locals as the Wolf Pits, after which the small village had taken its name. These excavations were ancient, but no one seemed to know when or by whom they were dug, but the consensus was that they were at least partly artificial, and very ancient. The most shocking thing about the children, which the residents of Wolf Pits encountered, was that they had skin which was olive green in color, yet the rest of their features were as human as the average Englishman. The villagers attempted to communicate with the children but were unsuccessful, as they soon discovered that the young boy and girl spoke a language which was completely unfamiliar to the villagers. The townspeople had compassion on the children and took them to the village and offered them various different kinds of food, all of which they seemed unfamiliar with and which they refused. However, when they were shown some bean stalks, they took them greedily, but instead of opening the bean pods, the children attempted to open the stalks themselves, as if they had been accustomed to opening stalks in this way, apparently a practice they had learned in the land from which they emerged. Upon finding nothing in the stalks, the children began to weep. Unfortunately, the shock of entering our world was too much for the young boy, and even though he became partly acclimated to other forms of food, he nevertheless became weaker and finally died a few years afterwards. The young girl, however, adjusted quite well to her new surroundings. In fact, she eventually grew into a mature, beautiful woman, and later married a gentleman from the nearby town of King's Lynn. As time passed, her husband patiently instructed her in the complexities of the English language, and soon she was able to communicate fairly well, and the story she told of where she had come from and how she had arrived in our world with her brother was even more incredible. She told her husband that her people all had skin similar to hers, or rather similar to what her skin had once been like, as over a period of years and exposure to the outer elements the greenish tinge had left her. She described her world as a cavernous, subterranean country of enormous size, a country which went by the name of St. Martin's Land. The land in which she lived was described as twilight in nature, yet there was a large underground river, on the other side of which there was another land more brightly lit. One day, she and her brother were herding some type of underground animal when they heard something like the sound of bells emerging from one of the cave passages or tunnels which lined the perimeter of this underground land. Out of extreme curiosity, they entered this tunnel and followed the passage upwards for what could have been a few days, although in their underground land it is probable that they did not have any concept of what day or night was. After their long and weary journey up the steep incline, they suddenly emerged into the brilliant sunlight of the British countryside. The change from their twilight world was dramatic, and the children walked around in the pits or trenches starved, half-blinded and disoriented. They shortly afterwards attempted to relocate the small opening through which they had emerged, but were unable to do so, because of the blinding light. At about this point the farmers found the children and took them to the village. A somewhat similar incident may have been repeated in the small hamlet of Baños or Banos, Spain in August of 1887, several hundred years after the incident at Wolf Pits and several hundred miles distant. We state that it may have been repeated to some degree simply because there appears to be some confusion surrounding the Baños account, apparently due to the possibility that some well-meaning researcher may have confused the two incidents, in essence attributing some of the events that in fact took place near Wolf Pits with the Baños account. Basically, the Baños incident reportedly involved two children with greenish skin who emerged from a cavern near the town, not pits or excavations, spoke an unknown language, and so on, although the details are sketchy. Some of the accounts of the Baños incident repeat the Wolf Pits story almost verbatim, as if, as we said, someone somewhere mistakenly confused the two events, perhaps due to a lack of detail in the Baños, Spain account. Whatever the case, it seems that something of this general nature also occurred in this Spanish hamlet, even though the exact sources of that particular story are more difficult to trace than are the sources for the Wolf Pits account. Paris Flamand refers to this account in his book, The Age of Flying Saucers, Hawthorne Books, New York, p. 197, having learned it from an article in the September 1967 issue of Orbit magazine, which in turn gave credit to an article in the Volume 12, August 1967 issue of Dan Fry's Understanding magazine. Fry claimed that he got the story from an article by John Macklin which appeared in the December 1966 issue of Grit magazine. The account also appears in John Macklin's book Strange Destinies, Ace Books. New York. Jack Bergier's Les Extraterrestres. And the July 22, 1970 issue of the British periodical Weekend. There are those who believe that similar cavern systems exist below the southwest United States, and that the Dulce Basin in New Mexico was originally an entrance to one of these ancient underground kingdoms. Sources say that the humans, possibly the ancestors of the Pueblos, once ruled this underground kingdom. One abductee reported an abduction wherein he saw himself traveling in a craft through an immense cavern below the Grand Canyon. In one end of the cavern were the ruins of an ancient city, and in one of the walls he could see what appeared to be an elevator type of device that ascended the wall and disappeared through the roof. In 1994 a file appeared over the internet which originated from a person who claimed to be involved in a secret group of Hopi Indian youth, boys and girls, who were being trained by Hopi elders in a race of human-like aliens codenamed the Blues. The Blues were Star Warriors who were in conflict with the Greys, which they referred to as the Children of the Serpent, a race of psychic vampires which feed off the passions, and in some cases the blood, of human beings. The Blues, the Children of the Feather, were one of several human-like races that had warned our government from having anything to do with the Greys in the first place. The reptilians have established themselves in the underground systems below the Four Corners area, in the very systems from which the Hopis themselves were driven by the reptilian sorcerers in ancient times. The Hopis emerged through a cave in the Grand Canyon and, according to Hank Cressman, who claims to have visited the underground city of Palauquapi below Arizona, the Hopis today, both surface and subsurface dwelling, still consider the Greys of the Four Corners systems and elsewhere to be their enemies. Cressman says that the residents of Palauquapi maintain some interaction with the Neo-Mayan races of Mount Shasta, who maintain a large underground city near Prescott/Groom Creek, Arizona. They have also interbred with members of the Nordic or Pleiadian Federation. In relation to Dulce, researcher Paris Flamwood once gave what appears to be a description of the joint Illuminati Grey Dulce underground base network below the Four Corners area, as described by researcher James Mosley. The intimations of strange pressure groups, purportedly intent upon obscuring the true meaning of flying saucers, began arising in the early 1950s, the most famous of these being the Three Men in Black and the Silence Conspiracy, which Major Kehoe and others regard as an ominous element functioning within the Air Force. During the summer of 1956, Saucer News editor James Mosley postulated an addition to this enigmatic company in the June 1956 issue of his magazine, theorizing that flying saucers were originally being researched by the United States in 1946, were capable of speeds exceeding 4,000 miles an hour, and were operating from a super-secret subterranean base below a southwestern state. He continued, the whole project is so highly classified that ordinary military pilots and even the Air Force's saucer investigators on Project Blue Book could not possibly know about it. In fact, this type of saucer is not built by the American government as we ordinarily understand the word government. As fantastic as this might sound, these saucers are actually built, operated, and maintained by an organization which is entirely separate from the military and political branches of the government that we know about. Although a handful of people at the very top of the government know about the existence of this project, they have no direct contact with it. I shall call this secret project the organization. James Mosley, according to Flamand, considerably elaborated on the activities of this shadowy cabal with some very extravagant revelations. In his book On the Shores of Endless Worlds, Andrew Thomas relates the following account. The Jesuit Agnello Oliva, 1572-1532, recorded the words of an old Inca Kupu reader to the effect that the real Tiahuanaco was a subterranean city exceeding the one above ground in vastness. It was believed that the entrance to the underground apartments could be gained through 4 tunnels. Last century one passage was evidently found as treasure hunters managed to get in, to look for gold, but only one came out. He brought out with him 2 gold bars but left behind his sanity. After this incident the Peruvian government decided to wall up the cave entrance. This tunnel, according to other sources, was actually hidden among the ruins of Fort Sacsayhuaman outside of and above the city of Cusco, Peru. The explorers allegedly found their way into ancient treasure caves beneath the Temple of the Sun in Cusco, and most of them subsequently became lost in the dark labyrinthine maze, except for the man who returned with 2 gold bars. There are however rumors that the tunnels beneath Cusco eventually connect with others below Lima, Peru, as well as different parts of the Peruvian Andes including the Lake Titicaca region. Dr. Clifford Wilson, in his UFOs and Their Mission Impossible 1974. Signet Books, New York, relates the following account, submitted by police officer and abductee Harold Shermer, spelled Shermer by others, who was the subject of experimentation by the alien group known as the Greys. He claimed that he was told where UFO bases were. Although he could not understand it, He stated there were UFO bases both underground and underwater. He wondered if perhaps these beings were careful to guard their own interests, for they gave no information that would actually endanger themselves. However, they did say that one base was out in the ocean away from Florida, out toward Bermuda. This is in the area of the infamous Bermuda Triangle, where so many ships and even aircraft have mysteriously disappeared during this century. Shermer was further told that this particular vehicle was an observation craft, and that the occupants had been sent to collect samples of animals and vegetation. He remembered also that he was told that some humans had been used in breeding experiments. He was convinced that something was done to the brain patterns of those who were captured, and was definite that he himself had been changed, as was evidenced by his earlier withholding of details of the sighting. By his obedience he had become almost robot-like, ready to do whatever they told him to do. On July 14, 1974, an article by Stony Brakefield appeared in the Pennsylvania newspaper, News Extra, reporting an incident which allegedly took place in 1944 near this small coal mining town, yet because of its nature it had been covered up for nearly 40 years until the son of the mining inspector who investigated the incident revealed it as his father, then deceased, had related it to him. This mining inspector and a fellow investigator had been called in to look into a cave-in in one of the Dixonville mines. About 15 men had either been killed or turned up missing altogether in the strange disaster. Once inside the mine, the inspectors eventually came across the first victim. Although lying under broken timber surrounded by some fallen rocks and rubble, they concluded that the cave-in certainly could not have been large enough to kill the man. The inspectors were shocked to find that the body of the miner was lacerated with claw-like markings from some unknown creature. They continued and found a few other bodies, all dead, and some of which had similar claw-like marks covering them. Several other miners had vanished, and were nowhere to be seen in spite of subsequent diggings. This tragedy apparently took place after the miners had broken into an ancient tunnel of unknown origin deep in the mine. This tunnel, at the time the inspectors didn't fully recognize it as the recently discovered passage or drift, was then followed by the inspectors at approximately a 45-degree angle downwards for about half a mile until they arrived at a room, which seemed to be the end of the passage. At this point the passage behind them just happened to collapse. Many accounts indicate that these underground creatures can manipulate the earth and rock and create cave-ins at will, as was the case in the Maltese incident mentioned earlier in the text. A follow-up team was sent in to intersect the inspectors while this was taking place. This other crew followed the tracks of the inspectors into the mysterious tunnel and eventually found the cave-in and began digging through in hopes of finding the now missing investigators. In the meanwhile, one inspector, the father of the man who released the story to the press, suddenly felt something like hot breath on the back of his neck. He closed his eyes, too terrified to see what the thing was. As the other workers were breaking through, the creature left by some unseen route, perhaps frightened away. The other inspector who was with him, however, observed the whole thing, and in wide-eyed horror he exclaimed, "That thing was not of this world." One account concerning the underground appeared in an early issue of Caveat Emptor magazine, P.O. Box 4553, Metuchen, New Jersey 088204533, and spoke of a physical encounter with a subterranean race humans. The account was related by an individual whose girlfriend, Larissa, had phoned him one night. She was quite shaken up and in tears, and told him that a friend of hers at school had invited her to go for a ride with her out into the countryside. This girlfriend was somewhat strange, and a loner, and would often disappear and be away from school for days or even weeks at a time. As they were driving through the countryside, according to Larissa, this girl drove her car right towards a hill, and before she knew what was happening the hill opened up into an underground road, and they eventually found themselves right in the middle of an underground city. She went on to say that the city was inhabited by the Forces, a human group who used the symbol of a wolf on jewelry, etc., and who were in conflict with another human group called the T-Forces. Both, she learned, possessed UFO-type craft, and the T-Forces were less powerful but were growing stronger day by day. Could this somehow tie in with Richard Shaver's scenario of an underground battle with Turos and Turos? The only difference would be that Shaver's Turos were basically friendly people and his Turos seemed to be a conglomeration of degenerate human techno-sorcerers whose minds and bodies have been affected by long-term exposure to radiation, who seemed to be in league with a race power-hungry Atlantine androids that had gone out of control thousands of years ago in what Shaver refers to as the vermin from space, a race of reptilian hominoids that are returning to planet Earth to reclaim what they allege to be their native planet. Theodore Ilyin, in his book Darkness Over Tibet, told of the inhabitants of an underground city beneath Tibet, a city which the author himself claimed to have stumbled on during his extensive travels through the Far East. This underground community was allegedly ruled over by a powerful sorcerer who was part of an international secret society. This overlord kept the inhabitants of the underground city, many of whom were people who had disappeared from the world above, under complete mind control to the point that they lacked any personality. Their eyes were reported by Ilyin as being vacant and empty, and their lives emotionless and drone-like, much like an ant colony. Or in other words, they acted much like certain of the MIB-like beings who have been encountered by UFO witnesses. This sorcerer was allegedly in contact with an infernal reptilian race via a bottomless shaft which descended through the city itself. When Ted Ilyin asked the sorcerer overlord where the shaft led, he was told that if he found out he would die. There are such secrets. Ilyin claimed that he barely escaped the hypnotic hold of the sorcerer and fled the city, and after surviving a series of terrifying poltergeist and psychic attacks directed at him by the sorcerer, he finally found his way back to civilization and safe. At this point we will quote from one of the many sources describing encounters with what may very well be a remnant of an antediluvian tunnel network that the Atlantines or their contemporaries had constructed before the deluge. The following account was given in a letter which was submitted to Amazing Stories, which described itself as a science fiction/science fact magazine, December 1946 issue, p. 162. The letter was from a George A. Lehue of, at the time, 1918 W. Newport Avenue, Chicago, Illinois. Lehue wrote, "Sirs, I have been a reader of Amazing Stories for a very long time. I too know of one of these entrances into the world below. It is about 50 miles south of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the first range of the Allegheny Mountains. My experiment with the caves have been only partial explorations, consisting of traveling about 1.25 miles down into the cave itself, and returning. The cave is ventilated from below, and stays at a constant 50 degrees no matter what the outside temperature may be. It is a series of rooms or galleries with narrow passages from one to another. In about the 6th room down, there is a large tree trunk which could not have come from the surface as the stratosphere, stratosphere, Branton, is almost completely free from local fault. And it could never have come down through the openings in the cave itself as they were small at the top, and kept getting progressively larger as they got deeper. I traveled down as long as I could find comparatively easy travel, about 45-degree descent all the way, and finally came to what I thought must be the end of the cave, for I could see no more openings into rooms, but on closer examination found instead a bore, about 6 feet across, straight down into solid rock. I turned my flash downward and could see that it must have gone straight down for at least 100 feet. The sides were perfectly smooth, and the shaft, or bore, in the perfect round, no apparent irregularities anywhere. I had no way of descending any further, so I retraced my steps back up through the different rooms to the top of the mountain where the cave opens into this world. I made discreet inquiries of several old-timers in that region, and found that in 1915, or about that year, 6 surveyors took gear and equipment, and spent a month in exploration of the cave, going 18 miles from the entrance, and down almost 5 miles below sea level. I have never gone back, but I hope to someday in the future, with escort, equipment, and supplies. I'd certainly love to see the machines that made that bore. If you have any information on other caves in that area, let me know. They too may tie in with this one, though if they do, their connections are very deep. Also, if you can, please describe the equipment that made that vertical shaft. Oh, yes, one more interesting item. The surveyors in their exploration of the cave distinctly heard the rumble of machinery, but their calculations proved they were nowhere near a large city surface, and they were too deep for surface noises otherwise. What is the answer? Another account also dealing with subsurface phenomena and creatures appeared in the June 1945 issue of Amazing Stories, in a letter submitted to that magazine by Jerry Lapriari at the time of 2024 Pleasant Street, Fall River, Mass. The letter stated, "You asked for stories that might relate to the caves. My mother was told this story by an old man who said it was true as truth itself. This man and a friend were hunting, agreeing this time to go to a portion of the woods to which they did not normally go. They saw a deer and gave chase. It jumped through a clump of bushes and they followed, to find themselves unaccountably in the strangest surroundings. They were in a huge cavern that had numerous passageways leading from it. Before them was a monster-like man they thought was the devil himself. The monster stared, and the two men stared back. One of them fainted from fear, and the man who told my mother the story dragged the other away in panic, and as he did so, found himself just as mysteriously in the forest again. The old man's friend died a week later as a result of the shock he had suffered. The old man tried later to find the cave again, but failed. I know this story is true because my mother does not tell fairy tales and because she believes it. In April 1972, a reader submitted a letter to Fate magazine describing what, if true, may be one of the more remarkable encounters with a subterranean civilization. The letter, which appeared below the heading Spirits or Subterranean Beings, stated, 2 years ago my small son Danny and I were playing in his bedroom when we heard a sharp metallic sound as if a large steel hammer had struck the concrete basement floor 3 times. It took us so by surprise that Danny began to cry. I was merely curious because I had heard a noise like that several months earlier in or beneath the living room. I decided to lie down on the bedroom floor with my ear to it. I clearly heard the roar of machinery, or I should say a hum. As I listened I heard something or somebody moving around and fidgeting with what sounded like machinery. I quickly got up and fetched a small hammer from my husband's truck chest and began to tap the floor, 1-2-3, 1-2-3, etc. I had continued for about 5 minutes when to my surprise the being beneath the floor began to tap back, 1-2-3, 1-2-3. As I listened I heard a series of noises and knocks, and then a man's voice began to speak, not to me but to someone else. His words were too muffled to understand. I called the local police and asked if there were any underground installations in our town, and they said there were not. Frequently after that I would place my ear to the floor and always I could hear the hum of machinery, but never again the man's voice. It is my opinion that races of people live far beneath the earth in vast networks of caverns, and they have access to miracle machinery that can project sound and even images to the earth's surface. I wonder if we are confusing these subterranean beings with spirits. Wanda Lockwood, Bakersfield, California. One researcher by the name of Frank D. Adams has written about the results of his own personal scientific experiments, which may prove that giant cavities exist in granite at depths of more than 11 miles, conclusions which have also been supported by Louis V. King, a mathematician who calculated that, at normal temperatures, a cavity would exist at a depth of between 17.2 and 20.9 miles. The author's findings are also supported by the recently discovered 16 Rouse belts, which give planes of fracture penetrating the globe. Dr. Ron Injard, in an article in the summer 1978 issue of Pursuit magazine, claimed personal knowledge of 44 underground cities beneath the surface of North America, 6 of which are alleged to be on the West Coast. His information comes from anonymous American Indian sources. When we relate this to the large number of migration legends to and from cavern realms which exist among the native Amerindians, then we may conclude that certain tribes still retain intimate knowledge of underground civilizations or are related to them via distant ancestral links. In the case of the Hopi Indians, according to Dr. Hank Cressman, certain Hopi elders maintain contact with their subterranean cousin tribes to this day. There are also indications that some entire tribes literally moved underground as a result of the encroaching Anglo-Saxon invasion of the Americas. Similar allegations are made in relation to the Mayas, the Incas, and several other Central and South American tribes as well. Carl Brugger, in his book The Chronicle of a Conquer, Bowie Tree Books. De La Corte Press. New York, 230 pages, gives the history, as given to the author by one of their chiefs, of the Yugamangilala tribesman, whose ancestors were allegedly part of a vast empire which covered South America in ancient times. Some of these ancient people, the chief claimed, left the planet in aerial vessels to explore other parts of the solar system and beyond, leaving behind vast subterranean cities beneath the Andes Mountains in western Brazil. In 1971, due to the constant encroachment of white settlers or invaders into their territory, 30,000 survivors of the Yugamangilala allegedly escaped to this ancient system of underground cities, consisting of 13 separate subterranean complexes all connected by tunnels, one of which is said to extend to Lima, and others of which are located throughout the Andes mountain range of Peru. Michael Burke, in his article Green Thing Sparks Rumors, The Valley News Dispatch, New Kensington, Tarentum and Vandergrift, Pennsylvania. March 5, 1981 issue described a short, lizard-like creature which has been seen working on two legs like a man, was reportedly about 3 feet tall, and half humanoid and half dinosaur. The creature was seen emerging from a sewer tunnel near New Kensington. A group of children chased the infant or young dinosauroid, one of the more courageous of them momentarily grabbing it from behind, at which point it let out a squealing or screeching sound, and then slipped from his hands and escaped back into the sewer tunnel. In later encounters, children attempted to pour gasoline on the creature and light it on fire, although most of the fuel fell on the ground, and the reptiloid escaped unscathed. Dr. Earline Cheney, in an article titled Odyssey into Egypt, which appeared in her cult-oriented magazine Voice of Astara, May, 1982, tells of a discovery she and researcher Bill Cox were shown during their tour of Egypt. Their tour guides confided to the two mystics their knowledge of 2 tunnels, neither of which had been fully explored. One was in the Temple of Edfu between Luxor and Cairo in the ruins of El Tunagabel, and the other near Zozer's Step Pyramid at Cairo near Memphis Saqqara, within the tomb of the bull, called Seraphim. The Egyptian government reportedly sealed both tunnels because of fears of certain archaeologists that the tunnels lead too deeply down into the depths of the earth, and because they found the earth to be honeycombed with passages leading off into other depths, and the possibility of explorers becoming lost. If such labyrinths do exist, then it may explain one story concerning strange men dressed like ancient Egyptians who have been seen, according to witnesses, deep within unexplored tunnels below the region of Cairo and the Great Pyramids. This may also be a possible confirmation of an account which appeared in Nevada Aerial Research's Leading Edge publication, to the effect that the U.S. government secretly maintains a huge base within a cavern of tremendous size, several miles in diameter, beneath the desert sands of Egypt. Could this tie in with the vague references to the subterranean culture or cultures known as the Phoenix Empire, according to Commander X, who alleged that representatives of this empire have been seen in the deeper levels of the base? And the Giza or Giza people, a subterranean cult of Illuminati-like imperialists who, so the Pleiadians claim, are working with other power groups in a covert attempt to take over the governments of planet Earth. Von Anne Green, in a letter which appeared in issue No. 14 of Richard Toronto's Shavert-Rhine Letterzine, spoke of a possible entrance to cavern systems near the bottom of the elevator landing within the Hoover Dam facility near Las Vegas, not far from the Mojave Desert, which holds back Lake Mead. Several people have reported unusual alien encounters near this reservoir. Early construction workers allegedly broke into and probably resealed large caverns while blasting out the cliffs near the base of the dam. In the lower elevator landing, according to Mr. Green, there was a wild tile inlay on the floor, with signs of the zodiac and all sorts of stuff suggesting an entrance. He suggests a possible connection between this and the caverns which the workers reportedly broke into. Could this tie in with similar accounts given by others that an underground base exists beneath Page, Arizona? This underground facility is believed by several sources to connect the S4 underground base in Nevada to the Dulce underground base in New Mexico via tube line. The Glen Canyon, Lake Powell Hydroelectric Dam and Page might provide a power source for such an underground installation, and is the most likely area in or around Page for an entrance, a deep gorge several hundred feet deep leading into the Grand Canyon, a large government facility, a hydroelectric power source, etc. This is however only supposition. It is said that Navajo Dam, by the way, is a major power source that supplies a considerable percentage of electricity for the upper human-occupied levels of the Dulce base. This may suggest that other similar bases are at least partially powered by hydroelectric dams. Paxton C. Hayes, in writings of his which appeared in early issues of BSRF's Borderland Sciences Research Foundation's publication Round Robin, referred to the discovery, one which he claimed to have made himself, of the mummified remains of a race of 7 feet tall humans who lived in huge caverns 9,000 feet below the surface of North America. Dana Howard, in her book, Vesta, The Earthborn Venusian, Essen Press, Corpus Christi, Texas, 1950, includes a chapter in her book which tells of a remnant of an ancient race or human civilization still in existence underground. These hidden people are said to reside within one of the mountain ranges adjacent to the Imperial Valley area on the outskirts of the Mojave Desert of California. John A. Keel, on p. 145 of his book The Muthman Prophecies, Signet Books, New York, 1975, states, an engineer, Rex Ball, swears he came upon a mysterious underground installation in Georgia in 1940, manned by small Oriental-looking men in coveralls and a few American military officers. When he was caught in the tunnels, one of the officers issued the curt command, "Make him look like a nut." He woke up in a field, uncertain whether his experience had been real or a dream. That seems to be the battle cry of the phenomena. Make him look like a nut. And on p. 192 of the same book, a man on Long Island informed Keel that he was frantically making preparations for the big evacuation. He even traveled to a secret underground flying saucer base, in a black Cadillac with a dashboard festooned with flashing colored lights, where he participated in a dry run. Other normal human beings were present, he said, and manned various kinds of equipment to communicate with the rescue spaceships somewhere overhead. Funny thing, John, he mused, all the equipment was manufactured by Weston Electric, Hallicrafters, and other United States companies. Tal Levesque, aka Jason Bishop, in an article titled Underground UFO Base Suspected by Officials in Washington, which appeared in the Volume 2. No. 2. Issue of the Hollow Hassle, described a suspected UFO base which is believed by some to lie on the Yakima Indian Reservation southeast of Tacoma, Washington. The book The Life of the Cave, by Moore and Paulson, 1966, gives evidence of extended animal migration underground beneath the central eastern United States, indicated by troglodytes, cave-dwelling animals found in widely separated caves which are identical with each other, indicating past interconnections which have become blocked. These caverns are found from time to time during deep drilling operations. A researcher by the name of John Singer stated the following in an article of his which appeared in the Missing Link newsletter: "Our nation's capital has its share of Fortean mysteries. There is supposed to be a tunnel complex under the Octagon House at 1741 New York Avenue, NW. Dr. John Thornton, the architect who designed the Capitol building, built some but not all of the tunnels. The course of at least two of the tunnels is known. One is supposed to go to the White House and the other supposedly leads to the Potomac. The tunnels are supposedly blocked up." Jim Brandon, on p. 58 of his book Weird America 1978. E.P. Dutton and Company, New York, added that the tunnels built by Dr. Thornton were only part of a much older and larger tunnel network constructed by colonists from Atlantis. Unfortunately, his sources were two unidentified psychics, so this must be a fascinating rumor. Note, this would depend upon whether these revelations were received by these psychics via entirely metaphysical or occultic means, in which case they should be viewed with great suspicion, or whether they based their claims on actual physical accounts. However, Richard Toronto, editor of Chevatron, claimed that some years ago, as a result of a printed request for information on subterranean anomalies, a scientist contacted him offering a 10-page report on a system of tunnels he had personally investigated beneath Washington, D.C. He stated that the tunnels were built by a very ancient race, and that the walls consisted of a diamond-hard, glassy or glaze-like substance similar to other deep tunnels that have been described as existing beneath the surface of northern Arkansas and elsewhere. As far as we know, Mr. Toronto never did actually get his hands on the report. Brad Steiger, in his book Strange Disappearances, Lancer Books, New York 1972, related the following MIB-related incident. At sundown on February 12, 1953, witnesses told police that they had watched an automobile enter the throat of a storm drain near Willowbrook and Greenleaf Avenues in Los Angeles. Officers arrived on the scene within 10 minutes, and according to the Los Angeles Herald and Express, they followed the fresh tire tread marks into the tunnel for 7 miles. Other policemen and flood control district workers continued the search for the automobile by dropping through manhole covers. The track down continued until midnight when, 7 miles up the storm drain, the tracks vanished. Herald and Express newsmen who had accompanied the police on the incredible search up the tube were witnesses to the fact that, in the muddy silt covering the floor of the drain, the tire tread marks were sharp and fresh. Then no more tracks. Stephen Brody was a man of many talents and hobbies, among them painting and rock collecting. Several years back he decided to investigate a certain area in Arizona where, he had heard, quartz crystals could be found in abundance. Brody convinced a friend of his, also an avid rock collector, to join him on a rock hunting expedition to the site. After purchasing a ticket on a passenger train, they traveled to a certain small community in Arizona, which was near the area that they desired to explore. According to researcher John J. Robinson, who related the account as he heard it from Steve Brody, the name of the Arizona town was not given. John J. Robinson, by the way, was a well-known ufologist in the 1950s, and the account as it was related to him was discussed by Robinson during an interview which was heard by tens of thousands of listeners to the Long John Nebel radio talk show on station WOR of New York, in March of 1957. The two rockhounds had their eyes on one particular bluff, which they could see in the distance from the town they were in. Other town residents heard about their plans and warned them against going to that bluff, stating that several people had in the past disappeared without a trace in that area. Brody and his friend blew off their warnings, considering them mere superstitions which they should not take seriously, and set out towards the forbidden bluff. They had no sooner approached the base of the bluff than out of the shadows emerged two beings who were each cowled in a dark cloak and hood, making it very difficult to discern their features or whether they were even human or not. After being confronted, Brody's friend panicked and attempted to make a run for it. Steve swore that at this point one of the black-cloaked figures raised some kind of weapon and a brilliant pencil beam of light shot from it and hit his friend, who cried out in agony and immediately fell down motionless. From what Brody could gather, his friend had been killed, although he never did see his body after that. Following this, one of the beings came up to Brody, who did not resist but stood where he was. While still in a state of shock, one of the creatures placed some type of device over his head, like a metal headset with two metallic discs which fitted over his temples. At this point he started to lose consciousness. The next thing Steve remembered after gaining consciousness again was of being in some type of dungeon or cavern-like enclosure, within a prison-like cell. Other humans were there as well. Most of the people there seemed to be under some type of trance or mind control, and as far as he knew, he was one of them. He dimly recalls waking up a few times, but usually when this happened one of the dark-robed creatures would come over to the cage or enclosure where he was and point a rod-shaped device at him, at which point he would black out again. During one of his brief conscious episodes, he had a chance to talk to another prisoner, a girl, who told him that their dark-robed captors were known as the Darrow. That, basically, was all that he remembered. The incredible part of the story, however, was the fact that several months afterwards he suddenly came to and found himself conscious once again. He suddenly realized that he was walking down the streets of New York City. He had no idea how he got there, or where he had been the past 6 months. It was like waking up out of a bad dream or nightmare, the majority of which he could not remember. In addition to this, he found that someone had given him a haircut. He didn't know whom. Whether or not this account has any connection to the many rumors of strange and ancient caverns and tunnels below New York City is uncertain. Some cautiously speak of such tunnels as being used by a MIB-like secret society, some of these tunnels connecting with the lowest sub-basements of the Empire State Building and other Manhattan structures. Some allege that such tunnels are the possible destination of many of those who mysteriously end up missing in New York City every year. Whether these are mere unfounded rumors is anyone's guess, at least until solid evidence surfaces to prove such accounts. John J. Robinson made several visits to Mr. Brody, and from his perceptions of the men he felt that Brody was sincere in what he was saying, but Steve was constantly paranoid and in fear that he was being followed or that someone or something was constantly watching or stalking him. Also, Steve Brody would often paint bizarre otherworldly landscapes, even though he wasn't used to painting in that style until after his experience, which Robinson thought peculiar. Then one day Robinson stopped by Brody's apartment to pay him a visit, and he was nowhere to be found. No one seemed to know what happened to him, and that was the last time Mr. Robinson ever saw Steve again. The Steve Brody account, incidentally, was also related in an article in the Volume 1, No. 3, 1971 issue of Strange magazine, and also in early issues of Saucer News, of which John J. Robinson, who lived in Jersey City, New Jersey at the time, was assistant editor. In his book On the Shores of Endless Worlds, Souvenir Press, Andrew Thomas, in his chapter Labyrinths and Serpents, states, according to legend, King Minos of Crete ordered his architect Daedalus to construct the labyrinth, a maze of passages so ingeniously devised that even the builder himself could not find his way without a plan. In the center lived the Minotaur, half bull, half human, to whom the Greeks sent 7 youths and 7 maidens as a tribute every 9 years. The Minotaur was slain by Theseus, who was able to find his way out of the labyrinth thanks to a ball of thread given to him by Ariadne. This myth has been interpreted as an historical record of the construction of the Palace of Minos in Knossos, which contains innumerable galleries and rooms. On the other hand, this myth may have an entirely different interpretation, similar to a cryptogram, which conceals the existence of a secret repository of underground chambers and passages. Although this might seem to be just a legend, there are actual accounts of alleged encounters with paraphysical, part supernatural, part physical, demoniacal creatures such as the satyrs, centaurs, and minotaurs, etc., which have been described in Greek mythology. Such encounters often involve paraphysical, poltergeist-like phenomena and manipulation of mind and matter. According to some sources, a race of beings possessing a combination of humanoid, angelic and animal-like characteristics predated Adamic civilization and were involved in the original rebellion and conspiracy against the Creator. Other mythical beings such as merpeople, unicorns, fairies and such were also traditionally involved in the fall. Like the angels themselves, some of them were deceived by the followers of Lucifer, whereas others escaped the fall and remained true to the Creator. The creatures mentioned in the 9th chapter of the Book of Revelation may be this type of demonic or fallen entity. These creatures were apparently distinct from the purely spiritual angelic and fallen angelic beings. Whether the following account describes an encounter with such a fallen race remains to be seen. The letter we quote here appeared in the winter 1962 issue of The Hidden World, one of several publications which grew out of the Shaver mystery controversy of the late 1940s. Mr. Richard Shaver, hoping this letter finds you in the best of health. My name is Frank J. Mezta. I live in the county of Imperial Valley, city of Calexico, California. Through accident I happened to stumble into your book Hidden World issue No. A1 and just recently A2. I sometimes wonder if it was luck or deliberate action on the part of Arturo. All my life, I have been looking and asking for certain, unsolved and unanswered questions regarding civilization, our ancestors and the beginning of time. I believe your book gave me the best answers. Let me tell you a few of my expeditions. 2 years ago, we went treasure hunting in the interior of Mexico, which turned out to be a flop. But in that excursion some strange things happened to us, which at the time we wrote off as superstition. We went to this place where we were supposed to enter. But suddenly a fright with chills came over me, something I had never felt before. Something like a sixth sense, like if I knew something was going to happen to me. I didn't go in and neither did anybody else. Next day we approached the cave again, only this time I wasn't afraid and I let the group inside. This cave was tremendous in size, and leading passages everywhere. Some of these passages or chambers, sometimes being 30 feet high and 100 feet long, contained connecting tunnels. We finally gave up, but in retrieving we found 2 leading passages instead of the one we had entered. This startled us, and we set to investigate the second tunnel. It just kept winding and going down, so we finally gave up and got out of there. When we got back to the village we struck a conversation with 2 Mexican Indians, and they told us that whatever we did, not to go into the enchanted caves. We got curious and asked them where these so-called enchanted caves were. They gave us directions, and that was exactly where we had entered a few days ago. We asked them what happened in these caves. They told us that people that went in there, never came out, that while in there, the entrances and tunnels would change, which happened to us, and we didn't know about this till after we had been in there. Then they told us the strangest thing, which at the time we said these people are superstitious. They said that they went with an expedition with 20 or 30 men hired by an American man to look into this cave. This happened about 10 or 15 years ago, they said. 4 or 5 of the men had revolvers. They were well equipped with lights and tools. While they were working there, all of a sudden in the far end there appeared a half-man and bullhead like a bull upright. This description fits the one you have on your front cover on issue A1. And next to him was a naked midget or a little boy. They pulled out their revolvers but they wouldn't fire, and their lights went out. There was confusion, and several men were killed in the scramble and nobody returned after that. Frank J. Mezta, 939 Genge, Calexico, California. David Perkins, in a letter of his which appeared in the Volume 1, number 1 issue of the Hollow Hassle, told of a strange, breathing well that drillers had broken into 17 miles east of Wolzenberg. Company other strange occurrences had been found on the ranch or farm where the well was located, including unexplained cattle mutilations. Representatives from the Colorado School of Mines came out to investigate the well, which seemed to breathe in and out with the rising and falling of the tides, and they excitedly suggested that a tunnel lay below which may have connected with a similar tunnel which the Colorado School of Mines had tracked from the Gulf of Mexico and as far as Oklahoma. A possible connection to this, one source alleged that an alternative 002 single quote type of underground city maintained by a secret society, can be entered via lodge in the Uncompahgre MTS. Also in southwest Colorado. Also, a large Masonic park exists in this same area. Any connection? Morris K. Jessup's The Case for the UFO, Annotated Edition, a classic collector's item republished by Gray Barker in a limited edition, was first reprinted by the Vera Corporation of Texas. This was an electronics firm which was commissioned to print the book specifically for the Navy. The original Case for the UFO, written by ufologist Morris K. Jessup, was not too revealing in itself but was merely a collection of theories and documented sightings of UFOs just like other books which were making the rounds. The interesting thing however is that Jessup was approached by naval officials and shown an annotated copy of his own book which had been sent to them by persons unknown. Later Carlos Allende, apparently one of 3 mysterious informants, contacted Jessup, insinuating that he and the 3 other annotators were representatives of an ancient high-tech Earth-based society of possible gypsy heritage. The notations and comments were apparently based on the secret knowledge of their race. They spoke of force fields, aerial ships, forces working in the Bermuda Triangle, ancient nuclear war on Earth, diamond crystals, and many other subjects of a highly technical nature. What caught the Navy's interest however were references to the so-called Philadelphia experiment, a Navy project which has been confirmed by others that involved an attempt to make a destroyer, the U.S. Eldridge, invisible optically as well as to radar. An intense electromagnetic field was allegedly generated and the ship did go invisible to the point that its waterline could be seen in the water, minus the ship itself. But then something happened, a brilliant blue flash was observed and the men on the ship were thrown into chaos. Apparently the experiment in its attempt to make a ship invisible had broken through the electromagnetic barrier between 2 worlds and loosed a whole Pandora's box of unknown forces. What happened from that point on has been debated. Some of these reported side effects included, the appearance of greenish fog similar to those observed in the Bermuda Triangle. Nicknamed the molasses or the push. In some cases the death of servicemen who became caught up in possible underlying electrical currents which set their bodies on fire in a type of spontaneous human combustion. The permanent disappearance of servicemen during and after the experiments into a parallel time-space reality. The induced invisibility, time freezing, or teleporting of Navy workers and at least 1 ship at the Philadelphia shipyard. Workers in the experiment state that a horrifying side effect involved the tendency of workers to phase out into another parallel time-space existence wherein they might be able to observe our world yet would be invisible and intangible, phantoms who are neither alive or dead as we know it. Some reports included a jet pilot involved in the original experiment who just disappeared from the cockpit of his aircraft, causing the death of a passenger. A man who walked through a wall in the sight of his family and was never seen again. A group of men involved in the experiment who disappeared into and out of a greenish fog during a barroom brawl to the consternation of their opponents. And at least 1 man who was presumed to have died or disappeared in one of the experiments who would appear out of nowhere at his mother's home, crying and asking for food, etc. In at least 1 case there was the recovery of crewmen who were caught in a time freeze for several decades, only to be pulled from an alternate time flow by none other than Dr. John von Neumann and his associates. Actual non-paradoxical time travel, the only kind that reportedly exists or can exist, may have been involved in this recovery. The experiments were reportedly assisted by Nikola Tesla, Dr. von Neumann, T. Townsend Brown, Edward Cameron, John Hutchinson, Dr. Emil Kartenauer and other top scientists, utilizing Einsteinian theory. However, Tesla reportedly sabotaged one of the first experiments after being convinced it would be harmful to the humans involved. Rumor had it that Tesla was in contact with extraterrestrials, Pleiadians operating from the Red Planet, Mars, and that UFOs were involved with the experiment in some way, attempting to guide the experiments in an advisory capacity via their contacts with Nikola Tesla. Tesla allegedly quit the project over the fact that too many servicemen were being sacrificed by well-meaning Nazi phobes who were insistent on developing the technology to aid the war effort before the Germans could gain the upper hand in the war. The UFO occupants in contact with Tesla allegedly warned of the dangers, however many of these warnings went unheeded by Navy intelligence. Note: 40 years later the project was reportedly taken over and continued by a cabal of CIA agents in league with the Bavarian Illuminati of Germany, and its fellow occult lodge, the Bavarian Thule Society, which had created the Nazi Empire. These experiments were carried out in an underground base below Montauk Point, Long Island, and involved time-space window experiments and mass microwave mind control. However, by that time the Pleiadians were out of the picture altogether, since these fascists who had wrested control of the Philadelphia technology from Navy intelligence were at that time in full cooperation with the alien Greys in a joint effort to establish a one-world national socialist empire. This war between Navy and Nazi intelligence went underground after the Allied invasion of Germany. There are allegations that Navy Admiral Richard Ebert and 4,000 elite Navy forces even made a secret attempt to destroy a super-secret underground Nazi stronghold in Antarctica codenamed New Berlin. This massive base was reportedly inhabited by over 2,000 Nazi-S.S. scientists, and nearly 1 million lay Nazis and slave workers from the concentration camps, all of whom had mysteriously disappeared from Germany throughout the course of the war. This secret war is said to continue today within the Nevada military complex between Navy intelligences, Com-12, who maintain contact with the Pleiadians, and the CIA Thule Society's Aquarius cult, which has maintained ties with the reptilian Greys that may date back before the beginning of World War II. Branton. As for M.K. Jessup, who was the recipient of several of the Allende revelations, the Philadelphia experiment was described in even more detail within the letters that he received from the mysterious Carl Allen, or Carlos Allende. Could Allende's contemporaries have been tied in with the UFOs that allegedly guided the experiments? Jessup continued in his investigation of the Philadelphia experiment, or Project Rainbow. At one point he informed a research associate that he had some startling revelations, and that he would bring the information over to him personally. Jessup left to deliver the revelations, but he never arrived at his friend's house. It is almost as if some dark organization was intent on preventing these revelations, whatever they were, from reaching the public. Jessup was found suffocated to death in his car, near a park, the result of carbon monoxide poisoning via a hose which was attached to his tailpipe and run into the car. It was said that when he was found, Jessup was still barely alive. However, there were no reports of any attempts to save his life. In fact, the research documents containing the revelations never turned up, and Jessup took his secret with him to the grave. The authorities who responded to his death seemed to be at least partially implicated. There is also the strong possibility that Jessup's death was fixed to look like a suicide. The mystery has not yet been solved. John Keel, in his book Our Haunted Planet, 1968. Fawcett. Greenwich, Connecticut, pages 113-114, relates the following. Another group of CIA baiting researchers is now overlapping into ufology. They are the comparatively small teams of amateur sleuths dedicated to investigating the assassination of President Kennedy. Here the black Cadillacs and the slight, dark men in black suits are viewed as Cubans and CIA agents. Paranoia runs high because now over 50 witnesses, as of 1968 reporters, and assassination investigators have met with sudden death, under the most suspicious circumstances. The full story of Kennedy's murder in Dallas in 1963 is filled with incredible details, many of them similar to things found in the most mysterious of the UFO incidents. Photos and physical evidence have vanished or been tampered with, just as in so many UFO cases. A wide assortment of mystery men have been involved, including the doppelgangers of the late Lee Harvey Oswald, C. Richard Popkins II Oswald. This other Oswald even turned up at a public rifle range before the assassination, making a nuisance of himself so the witnesses would be sure to remember him. He fired an unusual gun which spat out balls of fire at the target. He also visited an automobile showroom and went for a demonstration ride in a new car. The real Oswald could not drive. His whereabouts at the time of these incidents are known. And he was nowhere near the rifle range and auto agency. The huge Warren Report contains numerous pieces of sworn testimony describing MIB-type men in the vicinity of Dealey Plaza and the school book depository building immediately before and after the assassination. Long-haired men were seen. This may not sound extraordinary, but remember that long hair was most unusual in 1963. The Beatles did not begin to make an impression until 1964, and the long hair fad did not get underway until 1965-66. Researcher Vel Valerian in the early 1990s investigated the experiences of a woman who claimed abductions on numerous occasions near Mount Lassen, California. See Leading Edge magazine, June 1992 issue. Her abductors, she claimed, were humans of a generally unsympathetic and manipulating nature who were working with the reptilian Greys. During her encounter she saw the typical Greys, a larger gray with orange-red eyes and vertical slit pupils, and of course the humans themselves. At one point the woman took off a helmet in front of her, which seemed to be used to cover her features. Immediately someone from another room began cursing and told her to put the helmet back on. This abductee also referred to a head doctor who implemented a type of induced psychosis, split personality, on her through some type of techno-hypnotic manipulation. Mount Lassen has been described by others as being a doorway to another world, and according to early contributors to Ray Palmer's Amazing Stories magazine during the Shavarian era, strange voices have been heard there, and even rocks from the size of pebbles to basketball size have mysteriously showered down on people who have approached certain areas of the mountain, and this without any outward sign of volcanic activity from the mountain itself. Some years ago a man by the name of Ralph B. Fields submitted an account to Amazing Stories magazine, December 1946 issue, pages 155-157, with the assurance that it was true and actually happened. He and a friend of his who lived at the base of Mount Lassen in California stated that they had read an article in a magazine telling of the unusual quality of bat guano as a fertilizer, and that it was a very valuable resource. Hoping to make a quick buck, they decided to climb the mountain in search of caverns which might contain the valuable fertilizer. On about the third day of their journey they discovered behind an outcropping of rock a small entrance to a cave, at about the 7,000 feet level. They immediately chose to explore, and soon found that the passage widened considerably. They noticed that the walls seemed to be smooth and glazed, as if the rock had been fused by intense heat in some ancient time. They continued deeper until to their horror they saw a light up ahead of them. Shortly after this they were confronted with 5 normal-looking men wearing the usual surface attire that was common at the time, flannel shirts, etc. These strangers asked the 2 young men what they were doing, and when they explained about the guano they had the impression that the men did not believe them. One of them, appearing to be in his mid-50s, said, "I think you had better come with us." They were then taken to a large machine or contrivance nearby which appeared to be sled-like, with a copper-colored metal-like sheet covering its underside. It also seemed to hover perpetually a few inches above the ground. At that point they were taken onto the sled, which they later learned was constructed, along with the tunnel itself, by an ancient and possibly antediluvian race, and was based on a carbon and possibly electromagnetic propulsion system. The sled could reach great speeds and seemed to follow a metal strip that ran along the center of the underground road. As if this were not enough, they were surprised once again when another light quickly approached from the distance, a similar vehicle. Eventually the other sled as well as the one they were on slowed and came to a stop only a few yards from each other. Their captors fled in terror while the 2 explorers remained on the sled, confused at this strange drama being played out before them. They noticed a brilliant pencil beam of light which shot forth from the other sled and caught the fleeing men in their path. These new arrivals soon made it known to Ralph Fields and his friend that the men who had taken them captive were the Horlocks. They made it known that it was fortunate that they had come this way, otherwise you would have become Horlocks yourselves, and we would have had to kill you also. Just what a Horlock was they did not specify, but in connection with other accounts, they may have been mind-altered human pawns of a malevolent race, possibly even the serpent race or greys if we consider later reports of collaboration between humans and reptilians near Mount Lassen. These men did not explain much, other than the fact that there were many evil persons in the underground world who have caused them as well as those on the surface considerable harm. One of the men stated that such men were safe because the outside world generally did not believe that the outer world existed. The dilemma of these new arrivals, however, was that they felt compelled to keep the knowledge of certain of the ancient technologies that had been discovered in the caverns, and much of the operation of which still remained unexplained even to these cavern dwellers, away from those on the surface. Otherwise we might be inclined to destroy ourselves with these technological forces that we know very little about, based on our past experience of twisting scientific discoveries into weapons of destruction. Fields and his friend were allowed to return to the surface, but were warned never again to enter the caves. The above account seems to tie in with yet another report which involved a group of Spellenauts who entered one of several caverns west or northwest of Cushman, Arkansas. These explorers claimed to have descended 5 to 6 miles over a period of several consecutive explorations into deep and extensive cavern systems. At one point they claimed to have broken into a glazed tunnel of apparent human construction which was lined with metal hard yet transparent tunnel walls. Through these transparent tunnel walls they were able to occasionally observe a whole Hadean-like world of bizarre subterranean creatures, including hairy humanoids who appeared to be in conflict with a race of oversized serpents or snakes, and even giant insects, cavern moths, and so on. The most interesting part of their expedition, which was recorded in the Hollow Hassle newsletter, formerly edited by Tull Levesque and Mary Davis, was their alleged encounter with a race of humans approximately 8 feet tall with pale blue skin. These people were similar in description to a certain group of aliens referred to by John Lear and others which were reportedly encountered by certain astronauts on the moon, a top secret which the government may never admit to. The cavers described them as about 7-8 feet tall and possessing large wraparound eyes, but nevertheless human in every other respect. The explorers insisted that they were led to an underground city via a type of hidden elevator, and were even shown deeper caverns of immense size in which could be seen ancient repositories left there by a highly advanced, scientifically antediluvian race, some of the contents of which, they were told, remained sealed to that day. This may have been the same ancient culture which left the machines that were described in the Ralph Fields account. The explorers were told, via a type of translating device, that the inhabitants of this particular cavern city were descended from a family that in our own traditions would correspond to the biblical description of the family of Noah, that they had a book of laws somewhat similar to our Bible, and that they had come to the Western Hemisphere thousands of years previous and discovered this already existing subterranean world. They also stated that some of their ancestors had left the Earth to explore the other planets and stars long ago. Whether the following item has any connection with the people allegedly encountered by these speleologists is uncertain. The following was related by John Keel in his book The Muthman Prophecies. The Cherokees have a tradition, according to Benjamin Smith Barton's New Views of the Origins of the Tribes and Nations of America, 1798, that when they migrated to Tennessee they found the region inhabited by a weird race of white people who lived in houses and were apparently quite civilized. They had one problem. Their eyes were very large and sensitive to light. They could only see at night. Is it possible that these people may have later taken up a cave-dwelling lifestyle, if they had not done so previously, to allow themselves more comfortable living conditions? The many caverns west of Cushman, Arkansas have given rise to many strange legends and stories. There are accounts of vast underground mazes, underground lakes, caves which lead to extremely deep pockets of stagnant air or poison gas, areas where electrical lights will not work, stories of people entering caves and never being seen again, and even accounts of hairy humanoids throwing boulders at intruders, intentionally missing them so as to scare them away. In essence it is a place which, if Jules Verne had known about it when writing his famous A Journey to the Center of the Earth, might have been the inspiration behind his novel of a daring descent into the underground world. Lieutenant Colonel Wendell C. Stevens, in his book, UFO, Contact from the Pleiades, a preliminary report, UFO Photo Archives. Tucson, Arizona 1982. p. 79 reports on the alleged sixth face-to-face contact between Edward Billy Meyer and the Pleiadian Semyas. He was told of strange people, unknown to us, who live in the interior of mountains and caves beneath the Earth's surface. They are of various types, some with bluish skin, and others who often come to the surface and blend with surface inhabitants, unknown as to their true origin. Ferdinand Ossendowski describes what may be one of the most widely accepted legends in Asia, one which is in fact accepted by millions of people. This legend is described in his book Beasts, Men and Gods, 1922. E. P. Dutton and Company, New York. Quoting from the chapter The Subterranean Kingdom, pages 300-311, we read, "On my journey into Central Asia I came to know for the first time about the mystery of mysteries, which I can call by no other name. At the outset I did not pay much attention to it and did not attach to it such importance as I afterwards realized belonged to it, when I had analyzed and connected many sporadic, hazy and often controversial bits of evidence. The old people on the shore of the River Amel related to me an ancient legend to the effect that a certain Mongolian tribe, in their escape from the demands of Genghis Khan, hid themselves in a subterranean country. Afterwards a Soyot from near the lake of Nogankul showed me the smoking gate that serves as the entrance to the kingdom of Agardi. Through this gate a hunter formerly entered into the kingdom and, after his return, began to relate what he had seen there. The lamas cut out his tongue in order to prevent him from telling about the mystery of mysteries. When he arrived at Old Asia, he came back to the entrance of this cave and disappeared into the subterranean kingdom, the memory of which had ornamented and lightened his nomad heart. The favorite Gelong Lama of Prince Chelton Bailey and the prince himself gave me an account of the subterranean kingdom. Everything in the world, said the Gelong, is constantly in a state of change and transition: peoples, science, religions, laws and customs. How many great empires and brilliant cultures have perished, and that alone which remains unchanged is evil, the tool of bad spirits. More than 60,000 years ago a holy man disappeared with a whole tribe of people under the ground and never appeared again on the surface of the earth. Many people, however, have since visited this kingdom. Sakyamuni, under Gaghan, Paspa, Khan Baber and others. No one knows where this place is. One says Afghanistan, others India. All the people there are protected against evil and crimes do not exist within its bournes. Sciences are developed calmly and nothing is threatened with destruction. The subterranean people have reached the highest knowledge. Note, the 60,000-year period is probably greatly exaggerated. There have apparently been several migrations of surface tribes over the millennia and centuries into what might be referred to as this subterranean continent of Agartha. According to an American monk by the name of Ernest Dickhoff, as described in his book Agartha Health Research, California, some of the human inhabitants of this realm had established themselves as residents only within the last few centuries. This took place when an Asian prince entered with an army of 400 followers and fought with and drove out a race of reptilians or serpent men who had taken possession of these caverns. This invasion was initiated after it was found that these serpent beings were using black witchcraft to manipulate the minds and spirits of humans on the surface in a very negative way. According to one source, over 20 million persons of various different tribes and cultures now reside in Agartha, and many more millions on the surface in Asia accept the existence of such a mysterious realm, according to writers such as Ferdinand Ossendowski, Nicholas Roerich, and others. It is said that ancient library temples exist between the surface of Asia and Agartha, in underground vaults to which certain Asian initiates have access. Below or beyond these vaults, through hidden passages, the kingdom itself is believed to exist. Branton, Prince Chelton Bailey added, this kingdom is Agartha. It extends throughout all the subterranean passages of the whole world. I heard a learned Lama of China relating to Bogda Khan that all the subterranean caves of America are inhabited by the ancient people who have disappeared underground. Traces of them are still found on the surface of the land. These subterranean peoples in spaces are governed by rulers owing allegiance to the king of the world. Note, if the subterranea of America was once mostly inhabited by humans who migrated there from the surface or other parts of the inner world, then the fact of the modern-day infiltration of the saurian or serpent races, of which the Greys apparently make up the majority, into the underground of America must suggest that the major infestation occurred sometime within the last few centuries. The so-named King of the World is apparently a reference to the present of a long succession of leaders over the Council of Agartha, which would probably make whoever held such a position one of the most influential men in the world, for good or evil. And in fact, according to former Dulce-based security worker Thomas Costello, certain of the United States presidents in the past have not only held conferences with the ruling council in Telos, but also with these kings of Agartha. Telos, the colony below Mount Shasta, is reportedly a western branch of the Agartha Federation. A succession of many such kings have allegedly reigned over this underground realm, most of them probably receiving more adoration than they deserve, having apparently been regarded as gods by some of the residents of the subterranean world. If the King of the World appellation is any indication, this would not necessarily be the fault of these kings or leaders, many of whom according to sources have acknowledged a higher potentate than themselves and prayed to Almighty God on behalf of humanity. Just like the popes of Rome are rulers, secretary-generals, prime ministers and presidents of the surface nations, these Agarian kings possessed their own personalities, some being perhaps more suited to reign than others. Nevertheless, they should be respected as the elected or chosen representatives or spokespersons for perhaps tens of millions of persons who dwell within the inner world. The name of one such king, according to one source, was Rigdan Jebo. At this writing the names of other Agarian rulers are unknown except, perhaps, to the inhabitants of Agartha or Agartha itself. Branton, Prince Chelton, speaking to the author, continued. In underground caves there exists a peculiar light which affords growth to the grains and vegetables and long life without disease to the people. There are many different peoples and many different tribes. An old Buddhist Brahmin in Nepal was carrying out the will of the gods in making a visit to the ancient kingdom of Genghis, Siam, where he met a fisherman who ordered him to take a place in his boat and sail with him upon the sea. On the third day they reached an island where he met a people having two tongues which could speak separately in different languages. They showed to him peculiar, unfamiliar animals, tortoises with 16 feet and 1 eye, huge snakes with a very tasty flesh and birds with teeth which caught fish for their masters in the sea. These people told him that they had come up out of the subterranean kingdom and described to him certain parts of the underground country. The Lama Turgut traveling with me from Urga to Peking gave me further details. The capital of Agartha is surrounded with towns of high priests and scientists. It reminds one of Lhasa, where the palace of the Dalai Lama, the Potala, is the top of a mountain covered with monasteries and temples. In cars strange and unknown to us they rush through the narrow cleavages inside our planet. Some Indian Brahmins and Tibetan Dalai Lamas during their laborious struggles to the peaks of mountains which no other human feet had trod have found their inscriptions on the rocks, footprints in the snow and tracks of wheels. The blissful Sakyamuni found on one mountain top tablets of stone carrying words which he only understood in his old age and afterwards penetrated into the kingdom of Agartha, from which he brought back crumbs of the sacred learning preserved in his memory. Ferdinand Ossendowski remembered a particular conversation with one Lama. "How many persons have ever been to Agartha?" I questioned him. "Very many," answered the Lama, "but all these people have kept secret that which they saw there." In his book Shambhala, 1930, Frederick A. Stokes Company, New York, writer and traveler Nicholas Roerich adds some additional insights into human habitation of underground regions of Central Asia. In his chapter Subterranean Dwellers we read the following words. "In the Altai Mountains, in the beautiful upland valley of Ayaman, a hoary old believer, Snarover, said to me, 'I shall prove to you that the tale about the Chud, the subterranean people, is not a fantasy. I shall lead you to the entrance of the subterranean kingdom.' On the way through the valley surrounded by snowy mountains, my host told us many tales about the Chud. It is remarkable that Chud in Russian has the same origin as the word wonder. So, perhaps, we may consider the Chud a wonderful tribe. My bearded guide told how once upon a time, in this fertile valley lived and flourished the powerful tribe of Chud. They knew how to prospect for minerals and how to reap the best harvest. Most peaceful and most industrious was this tribe. But then came a white Tsar with innumerable hordes of cruel warriors. The peaceful, industrious Chud could not resist the assaults of the conquerors, and not wishing to lose their liberty, they remained as serfs to the white Tsar. Then, for the first time, a white birch began to grow in this region. And, according to old prophecies, the Chud knew that it was the time for their departure. And the Chud, unwilling to remain subject to the white Tsar, departed onto the earth. Only sometimes can you hear the holy people singing. Now their bells ring out in the subterranean temples. But there shall come the glorious time of human purification, and in those days, the great Chud shall again appear in full glory." Thus the old believer concluded. We approached some low stony hill. Proudly he showed me, "Here we are. Here is the entrance to the great subterranean kingdom." When the Chud entered the subterranean passage they closed the entrance with stones. Now we stand just beside this holy entrance. We stood before a huge tomb encircled by great stones, so typical of the period of the Great Migrations. Such tombs, with the beautiful remains of Gothic relics, we saw in South Russian steppes, and in foothills of the northern Caucasus. Studying this hill, I remembered how during our crossing of the Karakoram Pass, my size, the Ladakh, asked me, "Do you know that in the subterranean caves here many treasures are hidden and that in them lives a wonderful tribe which abhors the sins of earth?" And again when we approached Cotton the hoofs of our horses sounded hollow as though we rode above caves or wallows. Our caravan people called attention to this, saying, "Do you hear what hollow subterranean passages we are crossing? Through these passages, people who are familiar with them can reach far-off countries." When we saw entrances to caves, our caravaneers told us, long ago people lived there. Now they have gone inside. They have found a subterranean passage to the subterranean kingdom. Only rarely do some of them appear again on the earth. At our bazaar such people come with strange, very ancient money, but nobody could ever remember a time when such money was in usage here. I asked them if we could also see such people. And they answered, "Why yes, if your thoughts are similarly high and in contact with these holy people, because only sinners are upon the earth, and the pure and courageous people pass on to something more beautiful. This is not to say that there are not subterranean areas where evil abounds, but that there are apparently protected areas where animosity between fellow human beings is greatly discouraged. Branton. Great is the belief in the kingdom of the subterranean people. Through all of Asia, through the spaces of old deserts, from the Pacific to the Urals, you can hear the same wondrous tale of the vanished holy people. Note, one such persistent tale is that of the lost 10 tribes of Israel. Residents of modern Israel claim descent from the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, and half of the tribe of Levi who remained behind following the great separation of Israel in the time of Solomon. The only known people who claim descent from other Israelite tribes are the so-called Black Jews of Ethiopia, who insist that they are descended from the tribe of Dan. This leaves 8 1/2 tribes unaccounted for, or rather as some believe 9 1/2 tribes, because in the book of Revelation the 2 Josephite lines of Ephraim and Manasseh are considered as distinct tribes. Interestingly, the tribe of Dan does not appear in the book of Revelation among the 134,000 priests, 12,000 from each of the 12 restored tribes. This restoration has yet to take place, possibly because Dan was the tribe most responsible for leading Israel into Old Testament apostasy and idolatry. The only record of the missing 9 1/2 tribes appears in the 13th chapter of the book of Esdras, one of the apocryphal books containing Jewish legend and tradition which were written in the 400-year non-prophetical period between the end of the Taurahic or Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament periods. This contains only a cryptic remark that the lost tribes entered an unknown land to the extreme north or northeast called Arzareth, from where they will one day return in power. Branton. Even far beyond the Ural Mountains, the echo of the same tale will reach you. Often you hear about subterranean tribes. Sometimes an invisible holy people is said to be living behind a mountain. Sometimes either poisonous or vitalizing gases are spread over the earth, to protect someone. Sometimes you hear how the sands of the great desert shift, and for a moment disclose treasures of the entrances of subterranean kingdoms. But none would dare to touch those treasures. You will hear how, in the rocks, in the most deserted mountain ranges, you can see openings which connect with these subterranean passes, and how beautiful princesses once upon a time occupied these natural castles. From distances one might take these openings for Uris, because all which belongs to the subterranean people is concealed. Sometimes the holy city is submerged, as in the folklore of Netherlands and Switzerland. And there is folklore that coincides with actual discoveries in the lakes and along the seacoasts. In Siberia, in Russia, Lithuania and Poland, you find many legends and fairy tales about giants who lived at times in these countries but afterwards, disliking the new customs, disappeared. In these legends, one may recognize the specific foundations of the ancient clans. The giants are brothers. Very often the sisters of the giants live on the other shores of the lakes or the other side of the mountains. Very often they do not like to move from the site, but some special event drives them from their patrimonial dwelling. Birds and animals are always near these giants. As witnesses they follow them and announce their departure. The endless kurgans of the southern steppes retain around them numerous stories about the appearance of the unknown warrior, nobody knows from whence. The Carpathian Mountains in Hungary have many similar stories of unknown tribes, giant warriors and mysterious cities. If, without prejudice, you patiently point out on your map all the legends and stories of this nature you will be astonished at the result. When you collect all the fairy tales of lost and subterranean tribes, will you not have before you a full map of the migrations? According to the self-professed Telosian, Sharuladux, Agartha is the largest human subterranean culture in the world. Also, according to American Buddhist Robert E. Dickoff, in his book Agartha, referred to above, some of the Agarthan cavern networks were formerly controlled by the serpent people. These may have been antediluvian systems that were later taken over by the reptilian hominoids who left the surface of the earth to preserve their race from human animosity, an animosity that was fully justified. These caverns were located beneath the region of Tibet, which would place them between the Agarthan networks to the northeast that were occupied by humans, and the Padolan networks to the southwest that were traditionally occupied by the reptilians. This is where a major altercation between surface humans and subterranean reptilians took place in recent centuries, according to Robert Dickoff. Some of the reptilians escaped, according to other sources, back to the deeper cavern systems below the Himalayas and Hindustan, underneath which, according to Hindu legend, lies the dark and forbidden seven-leveled cavern world of the Nagas, or the serpent beings. Hindu legends say that the underworld, capital of the Nagas Empire, an empire which has been referred to in different writings as Nagaloka, Snaky World, or Patala, is a major center of reptilian activity known as Bhogavita. The Nagas, a race of 7-8 feet tall green-skinned hominoid lizards, are reportedly very cunning and intelligent and have bases all over the planet. A major base which they still maintain below Tibet is reportedly located in the mountains surrounding Lake Manasarowar, c. On the Shores of Endless Worlds, by Andrew Thomas. Souvenir Press. Limited, London, England. 1974. The serpent beings or the Nagas are said to possess many different kinds of machines including aerial craft. According to Sharula, or Bani, the Agarshan Federation of Humans utilizes their own space fleet known as the Silver Fleet. They assisted in the construction of Talos itself, or rather the extension of the underground metropolis from the already existing natural caverns below Mount Shasta, and are allegedly allied to at least 100 human-occupied underground cities throughout the world, many of them in conflict with the reptilian Draco species and their Grey collaborators. Sherman A. Minton Jr., a respected reptilian and amphibian biologist, in his book Venomous Reptiles, Charles C. Iber Sons, New York 1969, quotes from some ancient Hindu legends describing the Nagas or the serpent race. These legends state that this demon race has the ability to inflict almost instantaneous death upon a person through utilizing a cosmic fire force, possibly electromagnetic energy. Minton also states the fact that the ancestors of modern-day snakes once possessed limbs which became atrophied through non-use over the ages. That there are lizards with elongated snake-like bodies, a type of missing link between the saurians lizards and snakes, and that nearly all reptiles with well-developed limbs live underground. He also refers to legends which state that some Nagas were present at the birth of Gautama Siddhartha Buddha, and others which allege that a major book on yoga was channeled at a well which is believed to be an entrance to the underworld of the Nagas, located in Benares, India. Not all subterranean societies are of the insidious, reptilian or reptilian-controlled variety. As further evidence of this we add the following revelations from Commander X single quote, the mysterious anonymous the United States intelligence official who has revealed much about inside government knowledge of alien civilization both beyond and beneath the earth. He is the author of the book Underground Alien Bases, published by Tim Beckley's UFO Review/Abelard Press, New York. Mr. X was apparently very familiar with the subterranean world controversies that surrounded early issues of Amazing Stories magazine circa 1940 to 1945 and related publications in the early years when the science of ufology was first beginning to emerge. This may explain his present position in the United States intelligence and the sensitive knowledge that he has access to. He reveals the following paraspeleological events which reportedly took place in South America. Of all the countries on the face of the earth, none is more mysterious, or less explored, than is Brazil. Miles upon miles of this country have never been set foot upon by white man. In these areas live whole tribes of savage Indians, whose civilizations are said to be akin to those existing at the time of the Stone Age. Many of those who have dared venturing into these pockets of unexplored jungle have never come out. Perhaps the case of Colonel Fawcett will be familiar to readers as an example of what I mean. He supposedly was captured by a tribe of wild Indians while in search of a hidden city said to be located in the confines of the dense jungle. Before his death, Dr. Raymond Bernard had sent this writer many personal letters regarding his findings related to underground civilization. We quote from these communications in the following. I arrived in Brazil in 1956 and have been carrying on my research since I met a theosophical leader who told me about the subterranean cities that exist in Brazil. He referred to Professor Henrique de Souza, president of the Brazilian Theosophical Society, at São Lourenço in the state of Minas Gerais, who erected a temple dedicated to Agartha, which is the Buddhist name of the subterranean world. Here in Brazil live theosophists from all parts of the world, all of whom believe in the existence of the subterranean cities. Professor de Souza told me that the great English explorer Colonel Fawcett is still alive, living in a subterranean city in the Roncato Mountains of Mato Grosso, where he found the subterranean city of Atlanteans for which he searched, but is held prisoner lest he reveal the secret of his whereabouts. Note, Bernard refers to the inhabitants of this city as Atlanteans, when in fact other accounts suggest that, like the underground cities below the east coast of North America, many of these cavern cities were originally constructed by an ancient antediluvian race. This race might have been very similar or even akin to the lost race spoken of in the Atlantis legendary, whose abandoned caverns were later re-inhabited after the flood. In this sense the inhabitants might be referred to as Atlanteans, although the present dwellers of such underground communities probably do not have any direct genetic ties to the antediluvian Atlanteans. Branton. Single quote He, Colonel Fawcett, was not killed by Indians as is commonly believed. Professor D. Souza claimed he has visited subterranean cities, including Shambhala, the world capital of the subterranean empire of Agartha. I then went to Mato Grosso to find the subterranean city where Fawcett is claimed to be living with his son Jack, but failed to do so. I then returned to Joinville in the state of Santa Catarina, and there continued my research. Just recently 2 explorers returned from entering a tunnel near Point Grosso in the state of Parana. One of them had recently entered alone and spent 5 days in the underworld city there. It had about 50 inhabitants plus children. The fruit orchards were recently planted, and the inhabitants received fruit from another subterranean city. During the last visit, the 2 explorers were met at the entrance of the tunnel by a guardian and the chief of the city, who told them that they should return in 2 years when the fruit trees will start to bear, but cannot enter now. The same 2 explorers entered a tunnel in Rincon, state of Parana, and finally came to a chimney-like structure with 4 chains hanging down. They descended on the chains, but when they came near the bottom a gas with a chemical odor started to come up and forced them to ascend. Obviously the subterranean dwellers tried to keep them from reaching the city. This seems often to be the case, Commander X. Our explorer J.D. name on file, Commander X, who is a mountain guide of the Mystery Mountain near Joinville where there is supposed to be an entrance, said that several times he saw a luminous flying saucer ascend from the tunnel opening that leads to a subterranean city inside the mountain, in which he heard the beautiful choral singing of men and women, and also heard the canto gallo rooster crowing, a universal symbol indicating the existence of subterranean cities in Brazil. He said that the saucer was so luminous that it lit up the night sky and converted it into daylight. On one occasion he met a group of subterranean men outside the tunnel. They were short, stocky, with reddish beards and long hair, and very muscular. When he tried to approach them, they vanished. Often he saw strange illuminations in this area at night which were probably produced by flying saucers. We use the name Mystery Mountain, rather than reveal the true name of the mountain, so that unwanted outsiders will not come here to locate it. Throughout my many years of research I have accumulated a vast amount of data which would indicate that these entrances to subterranean cities abound throughout the region. An elderly man living in Joinville once told me that he had visited a tunnel near Concepão in the state of São Paulo, and saw in the distance a marvelous subterranean city with vehicles darting back and forth, evidently traveling through tunnels from one subterranean city to another. Although the following report requires confirmation, it was told to me by an explorer named North Carolina who said that he had visited a tunnel near Rio Castor and had met a beautiful young woman appearing to be about 20 years of age. She spoke to him in Portuguese and said that she was 2,500 years old. He also met a bearded subterranean man. Note, often humans encountered in aerial discs or subterranean caverns declare that they possess remarkable longevity when compared with the longevity of surface humans. On the outset this might sound next to impossible, unless a revolutionary scientific breakthrough on the part of these human aliens has allowed them to retard the aging process to an extreme degree. Or, could the possibly that they are separated from the degenerating radioactive contamination and solar rays prevalent on the surface explain their greater alleged longevity? Another possibility would be that through bionics or biological transplants and prosthetics, etc., the lifespan of human beings possessing advanced biological and technological sciences might theoretically be dramatically increased. Incidentally, the writer and traveler Robert Stacy Judd described in some of his books an exploration he and others had made of the peripheral areas of the Lolton Cave system of Yucatan. Legend says that at least one group of people, fleeing persecution, entered en masse into the massive Lolton Caves and were never seen again. Stacy Judd tells of his own encounter with a cave hermit deep in the cavern chambers who claimed to be well over 1,000 years old. This unusual man said that he was a guardian of the cave and of the ancient treasures and city, which lay deep below in the unknown depths, unknown, that is, except to the strange hermit. This unusual man had emerged from the inner depths of the cave when they first encountered him. Aside from photographs of this hermit which appeared in some of his works, the author also revealed photographs of underground gardens consisting of areas of the cave which contain small patches of jungle. Small cave oasis watered and lit through parts of the cavern ceilings which had collapsed in ages past, exposing them to the elements of the outer world above. Whether such claims of longevity are real or whether the subterranean people were just playing with the minds of such explorers who encountered them, is uncertain. Branton. Still another explorer named Du visited this same tunnel near Gasper, Santa Catarina, and behind a wonderful fruit orchard saw a subterranean woman with a child in her arms reading to it aloud from a huge book written in an unknown language. After she read each sentence, the child repeated the same, and in this way was taught how to read. All of these subterranean cities are illuminated by strange light. Raymond Bernard, whose actual name was Walter Sagmeister, writing in the October 1959 issue of Search magazine, p. 48, described yet another alleged encounter with a subterranean race. What are we to make of all these stories? Are we to assume that some of the individuals who told Bernard such accounts actually made them up, as some suggest, in order to receive the financial bonus or reward that Bernard was sometimes known to offer undocumentable accounts of ancient tunnels? Or, are we to accept these accounts for just what their sources claimed them to be, reports of actual encounters with the subterranean world? Bernard stated the following. Last week my investigators returned and said they visited their city, that is the city of a race of dwarf humans whom Bernard referred to as the Nibelungs, who live in a subterranean region with its own system of illumination, Branton, and are able to bring any of my American friends to visit it, but I require one condition, absolute secrecy, as I don't want governments to send armies into the tunnel to disturb these peaceful people. To reach them requires a 3-day journey of about 40 miles through a tunnel. This entire distance is through a tunnel carefully lined with cut stone blocks below, above and on the sides. That was quite an engineering feat. I think the tunnel was made long to keep out curiosity seekers, and only the most determined will travel the distance. Here is the report of my investigations. They are two ranchers, father and son, who discovered the tunnel accidentally. We left our house 5 a.m. for the tunnel on top of a mountain and reached at 3 p.m. We were tired and camped near the entrance of the tunnel. For 3 days we proceeded through the tunnel. We told time by our watches, as we could not tell when it was day or night. We went to sleep at 10 p.m. and awoke at 3 a.m. and continued working. By the third day the tunnel started to go downward by steps. Note, if the entrance was on top of a mountain, we must assume that it slipped downward until it became too steep to continue without a stairway. Branton. It was built of stone blocks on all sides. By the night of the third day the tunnel suddenly opened into a great space covered with what appeared as a sky with a yellow light that made everything luminous, like daylight. We saw a city with many houses and saw many people in the distance. They were dwarfs with long white beards and long hair, and we saw women and children, and heard them crying. The third member of our party got frightened, so we had to return. These men found 3 such tunnels. They entered another for 3 days, but after hearing voices further in, got scared and returned. Now they're entering the third. Previously, we have referred to the alleged inhabitants of a subterranean colony below Mount Shasta in Northern California, which is believed to be one of the largest, if not the largest, subterranean community in North America, and which allegedly has ties with the Asian empire of Agarte and several South American subterranean colonies, and possibly also the Have-Musuvs of the Mojave and Death Valley region. The following are some excerpts from an article written by William F. Hamilton, whose other publications can at this writing be obtained via 7327 Bothwell Road, Reseda, California 91335, who we have referred to in earlier writings. Bill Hamilton has been in data processing for 22 years and is now a senior programmer analyst. He is a writer, investigator and researcher. He has been involved in UFO research and investigations since 1953. Bill is a past member of the Foundation for Research in Parapsychology, the Spacecraft Research Foundation, the World Federation of Science and Engineering, and Mensa, the Hayek Society. He has been a member of Daniel Fry's Understanding, Incorporated, and served on its board. He founded Nexus and Nexus News, an info center for alternative energy and alternative lifestyles. He also founded a forum, a monthly forum on the UFO phenomena. He is a UFO investigator with Muffin, an associate director of UFOCHI, and founder of UFORCES. Bill is the author of the following books: Space, Time and Gravity, Center of the Vortex, Telos, The Cosmic Computer, Geometry of the Grid, Close Encounter Report, Alien Magic, and Cosmic Top Secret. He has written numerous articles for publications such as Search, Energy Unlimited, New Age Science, The New Atlantine Journal, California UFO, and UFO Universe. The following article originally appeared in the New Atlantine Journal. I run across some fascinating people in the course of my investigations who tell me many unusual stories. While on the trail of reports of UFO-based locations, I met a young, very pretty blonde girl with almond-shaped eyes and small perfect teeth, whose name is Bonnie. Bonnie has told me an incredible story and has related a volume of interesting information. Bonnie is sincere, cheerful, and rational and says she was born in 1951 in a city called Telos that was built inside an artificial dome-shaped cavern in the earth a mile or so beneath Mount Shasta, California. Bonnie, her mother Rana Moo, her father Moo, her sister Judy, her cousins Lori and Matox, live and move in our society, returning frequently to Telos for rest and recuperation. Bonnie relates that her people use boring machines to bore tunnels in the earth. These boring machines heat the rock to incandescence, then vitrify it, thus eliminating the need for beams and supports. A tube transit tunnel is used to connect the underground cities that exist in various subterranean regions in our hemisphere. The tube trains are propelled by electromagnetic impulses up to speeds of 2,500 miles per hour. One tube connects with one of their cities in the Mato Grosso jungle of Brazil. They have developed space travel and some flying saucers come from their subterranean bases. They grow food hydroponically under full-spectrum lights with their gardens attended by automatons. The food and resources of Telos are distributed in plenty to the 1.5 million population that thrives on a no-money economy. Bonnie talks about history, of the Ayers, Nagamayas, and Quetzals, of which she is a descendant. Note, many people have mistakenly identified the inhabitants of Telos as being directly descended from the Lemurians. However, Bonnie here seems to refute this by indicating that her ancestry age was other than this, possibly Mesoamerican and or East Indian. As in the case of the ancient antediluvian cities of the eastern seaboard, which were re-established after being abandoned by the lost Atlanteans. The Lemurians, if they existed thousands of years ago, also seem to have been devastated in a worldwide cataclysm, and their cities re-established by the Ayers, Nagamayas, and Quetzals as well as scattered members of other societies. The antediluvian Atlanteans apparently built underground systems below the eastern seaboard of North and South America, whereas the Lemurians apparently had control of the underground systems beneath the western seaboard. Although some island continents may have sunk following the deluge, most accounts describe the Atlanteans, etc., as being antediluvians. Being that the name Telos is a Grecian word meaning uttermost purpose, there is a suggestion of a possible connection with the Grecian-like Havmasufs of the Panamint Mountains of California, Branton. I met Bonnie's cousin, Matox, who, like her, is a strict vegetarian and holds the same attitudes concerning the motives of government. They constantly guard against discovery or intrusion. Their advanced awareness in technology helps them remain vigilant. Science fiction? Bonnie is a real person. Many have met her. Is she perpetrating a hoax? For what motive? She does not seek publicity, and I haven't developed time getting her to meetings to talk with others, but she has done so. There has been little variation in her story and her answers in the past 3 years. She has given me excellent technical insight on the construction of a crystal powered generator that extracts ambient energy. Bonnie's father, the Ramu, is 300 years old and a member of the ruling council of Telos. Many tunnels are unsafe and closed off. All tube transit tunnels are protected and are designed to eject uninvited guests. Does Bonnie have the answers that we are looking for? I don't know. Bonnie says she would like to satisfy our need for proof and will work with me on the satisfactory answer to that problem, but she is unconcerned with whether people accept her or not. Bonnie is humorous and easygoing and well-poised, yet sometimes she becomes brooding and mysterious. She says her people are busy planning survival centers for refugees. One of these is to be near Prescott, Arizona. Or, more exactly, below the Groom Creek area just south of Prescott, to be exact. Another survival center for refugees of the worldwide cataclysms, which the Telosians are convinced will devastate the surface of the earth in future years, is said to be below the general area of Jenny Lake, Wyoming, near the Tetons. The Tetons themselves have been the alleged home of a mysterious race. According to different sources, an extremely ancient stone buildings or constructions have reportedly been seen high atop the treacherous spurs of the Teton mountain range, Branton. When Bill Hamilton asked Bonnie to elaborate about the power sources which her people utilized to propel the so-called flying saucer craft, she replied, "A lot of it is crystals, that is crystal-induced electromagnetism. Brenton, particularly the atmospheric vehicles. The planet-to-planet vehicles are driven by an ion mercury engine. Spaceships can reach speeds way beyond light. They can enter hyperspace, you generate into the fourth dimension. This is controlled by an onboard computer that takes you into and out of hyperspace. I know this is a simplification. When you're on a ship going into hyperspace, you will hear this vibration, and a loud screaming sound when you enter, then you will hear nothing." Bill concludes, "I have had many correlations on this data and am researching it further toward a comprehensive theory of space travel." Researcher Val Valerian refers to an incident which took place in 1988. This incident indicated that at that time Project Blue Book was still as active as ever. Valerian refers to a Sergeant Robert Williams, pseudonym for his protection, who was stationed in Honolulu from 1971 to 1973. Williams was a photographer who worked for the Aerospace Audiovisual Service, AAVS, which is headquartered at Norton Ave, California. In 1971 Williams was approached by Project Blue Book to work as a photographer, which he did until 1973. On July 10, 1973 Williams was given D orders and a top-secret clearance, and was sent to Norton Ave and was briefed into a secret project involving the photographing of alien beings and craft. He was to work with Ron Smith, also pseudonym. They were blindfolded and put into a limousine with blacked-out windows and were driven to their destination. Both felt the car descend and found themselves in an underground base. Williams noted the time on his watch, and that 35 minutes had passed since the beginning of their journey. Both were briefed and led to a laboratory, where they found two aliens in the process of being autopsied. Another alien was still alive, held elsewhere. The creatures were wearing blue uniforms, and they noticed 6 scientists and 2 Marine guards. It was later determined that they had been taken to the 29 Palms Marine Base in California. They commenced to photograph the aliens. The bodies were black with green fluid/blood. During the time when Williams was photographing the live alien that terminated, and at its death he felt something passing through him. The scientists there, he noticed, had bland expressions on their faces like they weren't all there. He was allowed to enter the disc, which appeared outwardly to be a 35 single-quote diameter disc, although inside it was almost as large as a football field, indicating some type of space warping technology. After this, they were driven back to Norton Ave and then returned to Honolulu. The men noticed that no one would speak to them, even their wives. Smith later disappeared and was never heard from again by Williams, who, as of the early 1990s, now works in Nevada. Valerian stated that records show a disc did crash in NW, Arizona, and was recovered on July 10, 1973, the same day that Williams and Smith's top-secret orders came through. Aside from this, Williams stated that since the age of 3 he had experienced abductions by human-like beings, during which he was often taken to a place with large white buildings that were larger within than they were on the outside, each containing 600 family units. During these episodes he was befriended by a human girl close to his age named Karen, and this friendship lasted to later years. Through hypnotic regression, Williams recalled that during the drive to 29 Palms they, car and all, were transported onto a starship, where he met the ship's captain, none other than Karen herself. They were later dropped off just outside of 29 Palms, and the memory of the episode was removed. Actually, several contactees say that it is not so much a removal of memory as it is a transition into an altered state of consciousness and an alternate personality which has been conditioned to relate to the aliens, whether humans or greys. Since an alternate personality, psychosis, is involved and not the conscious mind, the conscious mind itself has no memory of the events. Williams also stated that Karen's people have developed time travel. Note, there are various accounts suggesting that it is possible to travel through time without violating the laws of paradox. In short, one cannot change the past, simply because the past has already been changed, or rather set through the intervention of past, present and future influences. It is suggested that the Earth is in a universal causality loop and that there was a point where time began on Earth or in the universe, and there is a point when time will end, is ending or has ended, depending on one's perspective. This is not to say that everything is set, because it is not. We have the power to establish our collective reality by choices we make in the now, whether that now exists in the past, the present or the future. In a way that is difficult for finite minds to understand, events of the past help to set the present and future, events of the present help to set the past and future, and events of the future help to set the past and the present. So in reality, one cannot change the past, present or future, but they can take part in establishing it. According to individuals involved with the Philadelphia and Montauk projects, a human soul is attached to the universal causality sphere or the time sequence at the point of conception, not birth. They are attached to the time sequence by what Nikola Tesla called a zero-time reference that is integrated into the human soul itself. Upon the point of physical death, the soul leaves the timeline and enters what we faintly perceive as eternity. Brampton. In relation to Williams' experiences, and his descriptions of advanced civilizations, UFOs and 29 Palms, Valerian states, investigations of the 29 Palms underground base during April 1989 tracked down some data about the geology of the spot. During the time when the area was under the sea, an earthquake caused a large hole in the ground, causing a lot of water to create a funnel-like structure in the ground. Evidently, discs go in and out of there all the time, and the Army has tried to send cameras down there, only to have the cables cut. One group that attempted to go down on ropes were exposed to a blue gas and had to be pulled out again. We quote now from parts of an interview between John Lear and the National Fringe Sciences Computer Bulletin Board. Question: you just mentioned that there were other species in contact with this world. Are they aware of the EBS? Lear: yes, they are. The types I will mention are listed in a USAF Academy physics book called Introductory Space Science Volume 2, B. I refer to Chapter 13, which lists the ones that are most seen. They are the EBS, the blondes. They look just like us but are invariably blonde-haired and blue-eyed. Don't know where they come from, but they do not interact with us except for a few abductions now and then. We also have a species that is similar to us in appearance, but they are about 7 feet tall, and the main difference is that their eyes wrap around their head a little more than ours. Another type listed is a small species about 4 feet tall, very hairy and extremely strong for their size. We don't know where these guys come from either. All this was in the aforementioned text, which was withdrawn by the Air Force in the early single-quote 70s from the book. But there are several people who have the original book. Question: I'm curious also as to the government's plans, if any, to deal with an uprising of EBS should that eventually occur. Or would the technological gap make an attempt untenable? Lear: it is my understanding that we have already lost the battle. This is the reason why MJ-12 is in such a panic. They had a lot of well-laid plans to inform us, and when the deception was confirmed about 1984 it was all out the window. Question: recently in the INF treaty negotiations, Gorbachev indicated that despite prior claims, they too were working on AN's D program. Is there any connection between our program and theirs, and if the battle is lost, why are those attempts being made? Lear: I wish I knew the answer to that. Several rumors have come out of the test site recently, and one of them was that every test shot this year, 1989, Brampton, has been to make a giant underground Brampton room. The shots are very clean, and as soon as everything subsides they move in equipment to make walls, ceiling, floors and various levels. If in fact this D program are being used to defend the Earth from foreign or alien forces, then someone, somewhere, might not appreciate such projects. Whether it is the serpent cults or the serpent race, someone or something seems to have been behind the mysterious deaths of several D scientists. British ufologist Timothy Good, in his book UFO Report, Avon Books, New York, 1989, describes the unfortunate fate of several experts who assisted in the development of the Star Wars defense system. Apparently, they were either eliminated by those they worked for so that they would not reveal what they knew, or someone or something else that was displeased with the ultimate product of their efforts was responsible for their tragic deaths. Certainly, all of these scientists dying at once cannot be explained in coincidental terms, whatever the case. Reports of suspicious deaths, darkly and deeply linked to UFOs, persist, however, and continue to cause speculation. Word comes from Gordon Creighton, editor of the informative Flying Saucer Review, who notes a possible deathly tie-in with the United States Star Wars program. He wrote to me in November 1988 as follows. Here in Britain 22 scientists have reportedly either taken their own lives or died in very strange or mysterious circumstances. And it seems that most were engaged in British work on behalf of, or related to the United States Star Wars program. The British government, it seems, was trying to hush it up. But press statements here say that the United States government had put our government on the spot and demanded a full inquiry. So, quite clearly, it is either the Russians or them. As many researchers have surmised, Star Wars, ostensibly conceived as a defensive system against Russian missile attack, may have had from its beginning a defensive UFO connection. Whatever the case, a mock test in September 1988 of an earth-shattering warhead, much like Star Wars in reverse, was conducted at the Tonopah Test Range in Nevada. Announced as a proposed superweapon designed to destroy Russian underground command centers dug in solid rock down to 1,000 feet, some UFO analysts believe that the real target is not Russian but another adversary deep down in cavernous installations in Nevada and New Mexico. According to the Pentagon, the proposed Earth-penetrating warhead is urgently needed. According to rumor mills, an alien race, the Greys, in their fortified underground laboratories, are genetically experimenting with the human race. Even more ominous, rumors say that their intransigence today may lead to new perils tomorrow. The following confirming article appeared in Washington State's Seattle newspaper, p. 1, October 8, 1988 issue. The article, which originated from the Hearst News Service, was written by reporter Bernard D. Kaplan, and titled, "Baffling Case of 10 Dead Scientists, Something Sinister?" Below the article is quoted in its entirety, Paris. They are calling it the Star Wars mystery, the enigmatic deaths of 10 British scientists and technicians, all of whom worked on projects linked to President Reagan's space-based anti-missile program, the Strategic Defense Initiative. All of the deaths have occurred within the past 24 months, since Britain began to contribute to Star Wars research. All took place in mysterious or violent circumstances. 4 of the deaths were recorded as suicides and 2 as a result of accidents. In 4 other cases, coroner's juries handed down an open verdict, meaning they could not determine how the victims died. The latest case came 2 weeks ago. Andrew Hall, a 33-year-old engineer with the British Aerospace Company, was found suffocated in his car, a hose pipe connected to the exhaust. Verdict, suicide. Only a month earlier, Alistair Beckham, a senior space engineer with another major defense contractor, Plessey, was discovered in his garden shed, bound up in electric wires running to his house. He had been electrocuted. Although Beckham's death was ruled a suicide, his widow was convinced he was murdered. Alistair had no personal or professional problems, Mary Beckham said. Single quote, "He wasn't subject to depression. Murder is the sole explanation that is reasonable." Member of Parliament Douglas Hoyle, who issued a call for an official investigation into the strange string of deaths even before the Beckham case, agrees that something sinister appears to be going on. The number of these deaths is now becoming too odd to be a coincidence anymore, he insists. The government has so far turned down Hoyle's demand, but last week ordered the police forces who investigated the 9 deaths to exchange information. Sources said NATO intelligence authorities in Brussels recently asked their British counterparts for a report on the affair. 5 of the men who died worked in sensitive posts for the same defense contractor, British Marconi, a NATO source said. 2 were senior scientists at the Royal Military College of Science. "We'd be remiss in our duty if we didn't take a very close look into this matter." Chief Superintendent Arthur Ford, the policeman put in charge of coordinating the investigations, insists nothing has been found to link the deaths. Hoyle says that's nonsense. He pointed out that 2 others, like Hall, died from fumes in locked cars whose engines were running. Police officials continue to theorize that the deaths were attributed to personal stress to which defense industry scientists are often subjected. Marconi personnel manager John Shipley dismisses that notion. "We investigated each of the 5 Marconi employee deaths," he says. "We didn't find a single instance of work stress or even suspicion of it," he said. Besides Hall and Beckham, these people died. Marconi scientist Ashad Sharif was found in his car with a rope tied from his neck to a nearby tree on October 1986. The car had lurched forward, choking Sharif to death. Open verdict. Ministry of Defense computer specialist Richard Pugh was found with a plastic bag over his head in January 1987. Ruled an accident. Royal Military College scientist John Britton, found suffocated in his car in the same month. Accidental death. Marconi design engineer Victor Moore, found in February 1987 dead of an apparent drug overdose. Verdict, suicide. Royal Military College scientist Peter P. Appel found run over by a car the same month. Open verdict. Marconi satellite project manager David Sands drove his car loaded with gasoline cans into a wall in April 1987. Open verdict. Marconi weapons engineer Trevor Knight, found in a car with a hose connected to the exhaust this March. Apparent suicide. Marconi scientist John Ferry, found electrocuted, in July 1988. Open verdict. Many UFO encounters, especially with human-like personages, have been relatively friendly and benevolent in nature. Yet there is, nevertheless, a far more malevolent group which has reportedly caused physical harm or even death to unfortunate witnesses who became a target in a cosmic war being waged against mankind by beings which apparently have little or no regard for human life. In his article, Incredible UFO Incinerations, Close Encounters of the Combustible Kind, researcher Larry E. Arnold describes the following terrifying encounter, only one of several cases of UFO-related human combustion mentioned in his article. Of the many episodes involving UFOs and the spontaneous combustion of humans, quite probably the most disastrous event, if true, in modern times occurred to the African village of Karamukuya on Mount Kenya. For several nights in June 1954, young Lely Thindu and his shepherd companions listened to the pounding of their neighbors' drums announcing a wedding about to take place on the mountainside. They also watched strange lights soar around this sacred peak in central Kenya. They naturally were startled when bright beams flashed from these soaring lights, then concerned that the drums were now silent. The next morning Lely learned that all the dancers, all the children, all the livestock, the entire population of the village, had been seared to death by terrible streams of light from glowing objects, report Brad Steiger and Joan Reitner in their book, Flying Saucers Are Hostile. It was not until Lely Thindu ventured into Nairobi that he was able to tell his story to someone who recognized the tale for what it really was, the annihilation of an African village by a UFO. The Kenyans are not the only ones to have suffered from alien attacks upon its inhabitants. Though the United States military is well aware of this threat of unknown invaders of the United States airspace, as is evident in the following quote, "We have stacks of report about flying saucers. We take them seriously when you consider we have lost many men and planes trying to intercept them." February 1953. Statement by the United States General Chidlaw in charge of the United States Continental Air Defense. There are many indications suggesting that certain humans have, in one way or another, been brought under the mental, technical or occult control of the reptilians over the years, whether they are fully aware of this manipulation or not. Could the being referred to in the following account, which appeared on pages 1136 to 1137 of Raymond A. Palmer's Hidden World publication for summer, 1962, be the type of subterranean dwelling creature which at least one account has referred to as a dragon worm? Could this creature, supposing it does in fact exist and is not the result of one man's deluded and misguided fantasy experience, be one of the many and varied branches or mutations of the serpent races, which many accounts tend to confirm as existing within subterranean areas? It would seem that accounts such as this one might raise more questions than answers. Remember that this letter appeared years before the advent of the famous Star Wars trilogy, which depicted a creature very similar to that described in the following letter. Again, one may wonder if George Lucas himself might not have been inspired subconsciously by certain evident realities, and portrayed some of these, although in a rather sensationalized manner, in his movies. The following account was submitted by a reader who chose to remain anonymous. He states, "Dear Ray, this happened about 12 or 13 years ago. I was in my late teens, I think, but perhaps the time is not as important as the incident. In the late night hours I awoke, got out of bed, walked out of the house and was met by a group of men who drove me out into the country to an old farmhouse. I don't know the location any more than the people involved. Maybe I was drugged, I don't know. At the farmhouse we went immediately to the potato cellar and through a trapdoor in the floor down a long inclining tunnel. We arrived into a room, fantastically decorated, bizarre, like Hades, how can I describe it? It was of good size, and others were present. Someone asked, 'Is he ready?' And the answer, single quote, 'Why yes, he is.' 2 others, one on each side of me, escorted me into a room. Tunnel? Again beyond my description. The worm, or whoever or whatever he or it was huge, long, round, knobby, and immense head and mouth which swayed back and forth, spoke to me. I don't remember what it said or my answer, but one of them put a syringe into it, and then into me. I swear the language spoken by them and myself was not English, but somehow I seemed to know, yet but not know. After some kind of warning and benediction from this being, I was escorted out. Once again the car, the return trip, and home and bed. Since that time I have once in a while visited the caves quite unhindered. In dreams and the like. Note, since suppressed memories of experiences with UFOs, etc. often surface in dreams or impressions, could these be actual memories of other visits to the nether regions which were suppressed from his memory? There is also the small chance that ray-induced visions or even astral interaction might be involved as well, that is, the abduction of the spirit body from the soul and physical bodies. The physical soul body presumably remains attached to the disembodied spirit essence via a silvery cord or beam of energy which maintains a kind of hyperspace link between them. Branton. I can only comment that the knowledge of, and use of the mix, the architecture, the philosophies in the pictures, or whatever they are, would enable man to live like gods in comparison to how they now live. However, the areas of horror beyond comprehension would have to be removed before this can be done. Note, the writer may be referring to the so-called superhuman abilities brought about through the use or manipulation of powerful electromagnetic occult technologies. We must remind the reader that power has nothing to do with benevolence or righteousness, or as the old saying goes, might does not make right. Such abilities to manipulate the forces of nature via occult technologies, such as those which were developed and utilized by the antediluvians, which by the way may have played a role in their destruction, and which is now being used by many of the inhabitants of the nether cavern regions, could be extremely destructive if placed in the wrong hands. Branton. An interesting sequel to this dream or reality is that I have prayed hard that this wouldn't affect my life. I believe in some ways it hasn't, but my wife feels that something, as I also have felt, is not allowing me to live as I want to. Of course I want to know, was it dream or reality? Name deleted by request. The following letter appeared in the July 1964 issue of Search magazine, and was written by a Mr. Irvin M. Scott of, at that time, 536 12th Street, Denver, Colorado. Mr. Scott's references to the origin of dreams is interesting. There are theories that the brain acts like a biological electrochemical radio transceiver at some levels. It is a proven fact that the brain sends very subtle neuroelectrical transmissions into the atmosphere, and that these brain waves can be recorded by electroencephalograph machines. An even more daring theory is that neurons can interact and affect other particles' waves in the unified field, and that the brain has the ability to focus these waves as a transmitter or a receiver. Of course, the success of long-range communication between minds is minimal when compared with radio waves, because of the thick morass of psychic static that must be penetrated and the minimal energy output. Others claim that certain alien cultures have machines that are capable of electronically magnifying and focusing thought waves for transmitting or receiving. As for dreams, some believe that they take place when the mind tunes into a deeper mental states wherein the mind is able to tap into the thought forms of a collective unconscious, explaining the universal dream symbolism which has been reported by psychologists. One symbolic explanation that has been used to explain this process is that of islands that appear to be separate and distinct when seen above water, symbolic of individual conscious minds. Yet the deeper one goes below the surface, the more they connect with other islands at the underlying levels, symbolic of the increasing levels of the collective unconscious mind. Mr. Scott describes his unusual experiences as follows. Dear Ray, congratulations on another excellent issue of Search magazine. I was especially interested in your article, Fisses in Your Dreams. Having had many strange, puzzling dreams over the last few years, I have become quite interested in any clues that might point towards origin and cause of dreams. I recognize a good many as probably having the subconscious as the source. However, there's an occasional dream that is so vivid and unusual that it causes one to wonder. I have no connection one way or the other on the Shaver mystery, but I will briefly describe dreams that are interesting in relation to that subject. On November 30th, 1963, while in a light sleep, I heard a woman's voice coming as if from a distance, and she spoke urgently as follows. This is from a stolen farm beneath the Salt Lake Flats in Utah. I was living in Wichita, Kansas at the time. There was a woman abducted almost 3 weeks ago in Boston, Mass. and taken underground. Reports indicate that an abbey in the north section of the city is being used and that cellars underneath the abbey connect with tunnels leading up from caverns below. This is a continuation of the Evil One's war against mankind. Another voice broke in. Don't believe her. Don't you see this is a lie, a trick? Then, Warningly, keep quiet about this. I have never been in Utah, nor have had no thoughts about or desire to visit, so if this was caused by subconscious, it is certainly puzzling, as is the reference to a stolen farm. This letter suggests that a conflict of sorts has been and is taking place in cavernous levels below Utah, as in other states. Earlier in this file we revealed an incident which was originally described by Commander X single quote, from a source in Dulce, New Mexico, stating that a certain chemical was secretly, via certain doctors, tied in with the aliens, being injected into individuals via sulfa drugs, which in turn lodged in the bone structure of the victim. This chemical allegedly makes their bodies extremely sensitive to extremely low-frequency radio waves, which can be tuned into the deep encephalographic wavebands of the human brain, and these transmissions could apparently be used to subliminally control or at least influence human minds from a distance. Perhaps some individuals, such as the writer of the letter just quoted, are naturally sensitive to these extremely low-frequency waves, and that their brains to some extent act as an electrochemical biological ELF radio receiver. Certain accounts suggest that various subterranean groups utilize ELF radio transceivers capable of penetrating many miles of solid rock. The letter just quoted might suggest that another group, more malevolent, utilize a similar form of ELF radio wave transceivers, such as the one through which the woman apparently sent out the distress or warning call. Could this other voice be tied in with a subterranean group similar to the Horlocks mentioned earlier in this file? Or could it have originated from the reptilians? The Horlocks are, as we've suggested earlier, a group of human mind slaves who were possibly manipulated and kept under reptilian mind control via implantation, technosis, and so on. Various sources have described many strange subsurface phenomena associated with the Salt Lake or Great Basin subnet. Some of these include 1. A reference to a system of tunnels and catacombs allegedly existing below the Salt Lake Valley, which were said to exist long before the first settlers moved in. Unusual stories have made the rounds to the effect that early construction workers in downtown SLC broke through into these underground tunnels. Some of these passages were later expanded by early polygamists who entered them to take refuge from government prosecutors. Others who entered certain of these tunnels never returned. Additional rumors say that lizard people have been encountered in some of the deeper tunnels, as well as unusual footprints of creatures with 3 toes. There are also reports of seemingly bottomless shafts. Also huge passages large enough to drive a truck through are said to lead southwest from downtown Salt Lake City to other chambers below the Western Rockies, especially below the Cottonwood Canyons. It is interesting that the Mayan Telosians claim to have a large base under a big Cottonwood Canyon. The Mormon Church has a huge underground storage shelter below Little Cottonwood Canyon, and the tunnels in downtown SLC are also said to connect with the basement of the Masonic Temple there. All 3 groups possess an initiatory order of Melchizedek within their structures. Interesting. Also, there have been reports of encounters with Nordics as well as abductions by reptilians near these canyons. One witness swore that at night she was taken out of her house in Salt Lake City by a blond man in a black astronaut uniform, who showed her a Star Wars scenario taking place above the Cottonwood Canyons. She saw cloaked discs emerging from Twin Peaks only to fire beams of energy at incoming UFOs. The beams hit what appeared to be the force shields of the incoming craft, and in Star Trek-like fashion the energy crackled around the UFOs, many of which seemed to lose motive power and drift away. Could this area be one of the standoff zones between the benevolent ones and the reptilian greys that John Lear, Agent If and other sources have referred to? Aside from these mountain bases, other underground systems are said to run southwest under Trolley Square, where workers also reportedly broke in to underground catacombs in years past, and also the old Sajur House Mall district. At least 2 individuals have reported abductions from this area. One man stated that he was taken underground just north of Sajur House, and was operated on, his right leg removed and reattached. Although the experience seemed dreamlike, when he found himself at home once again he stood up and his right leg gave out under him. Another person, a woman, reported being abducted and taken into huge underground chambers by way of a maze, just west of Sajur House Mall. She was placed in an altered state. It also seemed to be dreamlike, but she did experience missing time. She reportedly encountered a tall, dark-haired man who was in the company of a gray alien, and he gave her and several other people in the chambers different instructions, which she cannot consciously remember. One other incident was reported by a woman who was part of a night cleaning crew in the multi-leveled Crossroads Mall. She claimed that one night a creature came around the corner, wobbled up to her, and snarled viciously as it went past. She could only describe it as a demon. However, the apparent physical tangibility of the creature may suggest that it was one of the so-called lizard people or reptilians that are rumored to stalk the lower tunnels below the mall. One worker who had gone into the tunnels reportedly placed his hand against one tunnel wall, at which point his arm went through the wall, an extremely unnerving experience. The next time he was there he attempted the same thing, but the wall was solid. Could the aliens temporarily phase-shift the molecules within an underground passage in order to pass through to hidden chambers beyond? Others have reported passing rooms from which an unusual greenish luminescence emanated. Others speak of tunnels that have been sealed or locked by wooden doors that seem to be ancient, or by metal doors or gates. There are also reports of people entering the sewer or drainage tunnels under downtown SLC, peeking into huge chambers, and seeing men in suits carrying Uzi machine guns. Could these be Mormon church security officers protecting the basement levels of Temple Square from unwanted alien intruders from below? 2. Certain geologists state that the Great Salt Lake has an underground counterpart deep below it, and that a certain type of earthquake could conceivably empty the entire contents of the lake into its subterranean counterpart. There are vague rumors of underground streams or rivers which allegedly flow from huge caverns in the heart of the Wasatch MTS/Western Rockies, caverns which can supposedly be entered by following the right path through the underground maze, and westward below the valley floor, possibly to the underground counterpart of the Great Salt Lake. 3. A former worker in Utah's Dogway Proving Ground, where former Dulce base worker Thomas Costello alleges there is an entrance to the underground systems, reported that he witnessed people working at the base facility who were not human. He could not explain, but he did state that he learned of top-secret robotics and even Philadelphia experiment-like teleportation research that was being conducted at the base. Also, there have been reports similar to those at Dulce, New Mexico, the Nevada test site, the Madigan Medical Facility in Washington State, and at Deep Springs, California, particularly from a former hairdresser at the Dogway base whose name was Barbara, that there were several reptilian beings working at the base who were masquerading as humans. She stated that even one of the base commanders was not human. She saw him momentarily transformed before her eyes. 4. There are many accounts of various alien bases throughout Utah occupied by the Nordics, the Greys, secret societies, the large L humans, possibly the Orange, and of course the Hebrides, and possibly even natural-born humans who are being held prisoner in reptilian strongholds. This latter possibility was confirmed by Val Valerian in the Leading Edge newsletter, in which he stated his belief that, based on the numerous accounts that he had gathered, scores of underground installations hold citizens of virtually every country on the planet in captivity. Valerian is of course referring to the Dulce facility, as well as other such facilities throughout the world where permanent abductees reportedly end up. This may also include other people who have disappeared in other ways. One possible subterranean abduction was described by researcher John Grant in his book Great Mysteries, Chartwell Books. Secaucus, New Jersey. 1988, Grant records the following frightening incident. In 1975, Mr. and Mrs. Jackson Wright were driving to New York through blinding snow. In the Lincoln Tunnel they agreed to pause and wipe snow from the front and rear windows. Jackson Wright never saw his wife, Martha, again. People just don't disappear without a trace, never to be heard from again, especially in a place like this unless something intentionally causes such a disappearance to take place. There have, incidentally, been reports of UFO-like objects and or alien creatures being seen in connection with abductions which took place in underground tunnels, some deserted by our standards and others not. One case involved some teenage boys in Europe who swore that their abductors, Greys, took them to a base underground via a long-abandoned World War II railway tunnel. It is uncertain just how many human casualties the human race may have suffered as a result of the DA or DA wars over the centuries. DA is the Hebrew name of the tree where, tradition holds, the human and serpent races first came into conflict, yet based on the various accounts which we have covered in this film, we can assume that the victims have been in the tens of thousands at the very least. In the meantime, the abductions of humans, an integral part of the Evil One's warfare against God and men's souls, are still taking place. Whether the victims are taken to underground or off-planet areas is difficult to tell in any given case, although there is reason to believe that both possibilities are a reality. There have, believe it or not, been abductions which have occurred in connection with UFO activity that have involved not a few, not dozens, nor hundreds but thousands of people who have disappeared without a trace, or been abducted, en masse. Such is the case with the following well-known and documented incident that has baffled the many researchers who have mentioned it in their writings. In the winter of 1930, a profoundly disturbing incident took place in Canada. Trapper Arnaud Lorette and his son observed a strange light crossing the northern sky. It appeared to be headed for the Lake Conjecuni area. The two trappers described it as being alternatingly bullet-shaped and cylinder-shaped. Another trapper named Joe LaBelle had snowshoed into the village of the Lake Conjecuni people, and been chilled to discover that the normally bustling community was silent, and not a soul was moving in the streets. Even the sled dogs, which would normally have bayed welcome, were silent. The shanties were choked with snow, and not a chimney showed smoke. The trapper found the village kayaks tied up on the shore of the lake. Inside the shanties the trapper found a further surprise. There were meals left hanging over fires, long grown old and moldy, apparently abandoned as they were being cooked. The men's rifles were still standing by the doors. This really frightened the trapper, because he knew that these people would never leave their precious weapons behind. He reported his discovery to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who investigated further. They discovered that the town's dogs died of hunger, chained beneath a tree and covered by a snowdrift. More disturbingly, the town graveyard had been emptied. The graves were now yawning pits. Despite the frozen ground, the graves had been opened and the dead removed. Whitley Strieber, who claimed to have had several abduction-type experiences since a young age involving different types of beings, both apparently physical and paraphasial, does not hold to the idea that these creatures are originally from deep space. He believes that some of them may come from the nether regions of the Earth, and may have been here for millennia, being part of an ancient conspiracy to occultically control or manipulate the human race. He is not certain exactly what the creatures behind his abductions were, but he did suggest that the ancient, fallen elementals might be involved. Strieber had some comments of his own concerning the strange mass abduction near the Lake Conjecuni area. In his book, Majestic, he stated, "The RCMP continues the case open to this day." A check with the Records Department indicated that the matter remains unsolved, and despite a search of the whole of Canada and inquiries throughout the world, not a single trace of the missing 1,200 men, women and children were ever found. Strieber related still another incident in this same book, of a mysterious abduction, apparently, to underground regions. The first seemingly related case of disappearance in the United States history, that is, related to cases given by Strieber earlier in his book, concerning people who were allegedly pursued by unknown objects and experienced near abductions yet managed to escape, and others who were captured in the full sight of witnesses and never seen again, Branton. Took place on the 23rd of September 1880 near the town of Gallatin, Tennessee. At approximately 3:30 on that sunny afternoon, Mr. David Lang, a farmer, dematerialized in front of 5 witnesses, including his wife, his 2 children, his father-in-law and a local judge. The father-in-law and the judge had just pulled up in a carriage. Mr. Lang moved toward them across a field followed by his family. Without warning, he simply ceased to exist. There was no cry, no sign of distress. Mrs. Lang, distraught, rushed up and pounded the ground where he had been working. All that afternoon, and into the night the field was searched. Subsequently the county surveyor determined that there were no hidden caves or sinkholes in the area of the disappearance. The subsequent April, 7 months later, Strieber writes, the children heard their father crying distantly underneath the field. He seemed desperate and tortured, and was begging for help. His voice gradually died away and was not heard again. Where he was last seen, there was a circle of withered yellow grass 20 feet in diameter. The family moved away from the farm. It can be surmised that Mr. Lang was not removed above ground, but rather was taken into the earth and kept alive there for some months. Strieber continues, judging from the cries that were heard the next April. What the poor man suffered during that time, and what finally put him out of his misery, can scarcely be imagined. He was apparently left to languish in some subterranean prison, presumably dying when his food and water ran out. Evidence is beginning to mount that many of the human and animal organs from mutilation victims are being used by an entirely different alien group than the reptilian saurians. although the Soroids are apparently working in full cooperation with this other group by assisting in the construction of physical biological forms which can be possessed and animated by an insidious group of supernatural non-physical entities, the Infernals or Poltergeists. Whitley Strieber stated that he encountered some of these entities during an abduction, and noticed an area on their craft where these malevolent, fearful creatures stored these bodies when they were not in use. These energy beings, he came to realize, used such physical shells to operate in the physical dimension, much like a human being enters a diving suit in order to operate underwater. The Leading Edge magazine from March 1990 quoted one inside source as saying that these beings have a physical presence, generate biological structures that functioned as containers for them. The aliens manufacture containers for themselves, fabricate their own bodies, using biologicals gained from humans and cattle. A publication titled America's Missing and Exploited Children, published by the United States Department of Justice, Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, Washington, D.C., made the following statement: even the most conservative estimates suggest that several 100,000 children are missing within the course of the year, in the United States alone. Also, in 1983, the United States Department of Health and Human Services put the number at 1.5 million a year, a figure that has been widely circulated by private organizations. But experts say roughly 95% of these are runaways, many of whom return home within days and are counted repeatedly if they run away more than once a year. This would apparently put the number of those who are abducted in one way or another to at least 75,000 per year. Still a considerably large number. Commander X single quote, from his apparent though guarded vantage point within the intelligence community, claims to be privy to much deep-level inside information, as we have seen in earlier writings. One of the reports that crossed his desk involved the experience of a woman who was abducted and taken over 1,000 miles to the underground facility below Dulce, New Mexico. One woman I have spoken with was abducted from the roof of a New York City apartment building and apparently held underground at the Dulce facility. She was taken to a cabin in the desert which was being used as a camouflaged entrance to the alien base. She was eventually escorted to the laboratories to be used as a test subject, but at the last minute managed to escape thanks to the aid of one of the Nordic-type, tall aliens, who befriended her and showed her a secret way out, down an unguarded shaft. Back in the desert, she was rescued by members of the Blue Barrets, and eventually flown back to Manhattan. During a debriefing session with the military, she was warned to remain silent about her experiences. Anyone hearing such a bizarre tale would certainly think she had gone insane. It was inferred she could be committed to a mental institution at any time should she refuse to go along with the cover-up conspiracy, which she was told was being conducted for the sake of the country, and the sake of the world. If you believe that excuse, then I have some beachfront property on Mercury that you might be interested in. Brenton William Cooper stated at the Muffin Symposium in Las Vegas in 1989 that over 3,000 children disappear yearly in one section of Manhattan alone. Could there be some connection? The accounts of disappearances around underground tunnels and caverns are seemingly endless, as we see in the following incident recorded in Harold T. Wilkins' book Flying Saucers Uncensored, p. 47, June 7, 1954, 3 German tourists who entered the vast Lamprecht Cave, near Laufer, in the Salzburg mountain region of Austria have never been found. Their automobile was left locked outside the cave. The above may very well be merely a case of amateur speleologists getting lost in labyrinthine caves, although it is unusual for 3 men to vanish in this fashion. But I must risk the charge of being accused of fancy and moonshine, when I say that both in England and the United States, there are regions of limestone caverns and mountains from which queer phenomena associated with white lights descending to ground level from great altitudes have been reported. Similar disappearances were recorded by John Keel in his book Our Haunted Planet, pages 202-208. There are periodic waves of disappearances which create brief sensations in the newspapers and are quickly forgotten. No one ever manages to find out where these people have gone. In 1912 5 men, all unrelated, disappeared unaccountably in a single week in Buffalo, New York. Montreal, Canada, had a wave of missing persons in July 1883, and again in July 1892. Children vanish more frequently than any other group. We're not talking about ordinary runaways. In August 1869, 13 children vanished in Cork, Ireland. No sign of kidnapping or foul play. The same month there was a wave of disappearing children in Brussels, Belgium. Another group of youngsters melted away in Belfast in August, 1895. And again in August, 1920, 8 girls, all under 12 years of age, disappeared forever in Belfast. Actually, children have been disappearing in large numbers for centuries all over the world, and most of these cases have remained unsolved. In the Middle Ages it was popularly believed that fairies and leprechauns frequently stole children away. The Indians of North and South America also have many myths and stories about children being kidnapped by little people. The notion that parahumans kidnap children is deeply entrenched in every culture. The celebrated Pied Piper of Hameln, Germany, is more than just a charming children's story. A stranger actually did appear in Hameln in the Middle Ages, and he lured away 150 children never to be seen again. The event is still commemorated with an annual festival in Hameln. One of the old versions of the story says that the children were taken to a subterranean cavern, Branton. In AD 1212 a teenage boy in France, Stephen of Blois, began to hear voices which inspired him to collect together 50,000 children for the pathetic children's crusade. They marched off to do battle with the infidels and disappeared en masse. The popular explanation is that they were all seized by slavers. Ufologist Jerome Clark uncovered an extraordinary item from an old 1939 newspaper. On a day in the late summer, 1939, a military transport left the Marine Naval Air Station in San Diego, California, for a routine flight to Honolulu. Clark wrote in Flying Saucer Review. About 3 hours afterwards several urgent distress signals sounded from the plane and then silence. Later the craft came limping back to execute an emergency landing. When air station personnel entered the plane, they found every man of the crew, including the co-pilot who had lived long enough to pilot the craft back to its base, dead of unknown causes. Each of the bodies carried large, gaping wounds, and the outside of the ship was similarly marked. Air station men who touched parts of the craft came down with a mysterious skin infection. One of the most puzzling aspects of the whole affair was that the .45 automatics carried by the pilot and co-pilot as service pieces had been emptied, and the shells lay on the floor. A smell of rotten eggs pervaded the atmosphere inside the plane. Mysterious skin infections and rotten egg odors, hydrogen sulfide, are phenomena familiar to all UFO researchers. It would seem that the transport was attacked, apparently without provocation, by some sort of strange aerial intruder. The following account, taken from the May 1946 issue of Amazing Stories magazine, pages 171-173, seems to contain information which would explain many of the missing pieces of the overall Men in Black phenomena. At least some of the MIB have been variously described as Oriental or androidal-like beings, although as John Keel has stated, others seem to portray reptilian characteristics. Abductee Krista Tilton allegedly encountered some MIBs in a black automobile within Boynton Canyon, near Sedona, Arizona, a reported base site. She described them as follows: the men did not look right. Their faces had no expression on them whatsoever. They looked like they were wearing chalky tan makeup. Their movements were robot-like and unearthly. The Amazing Stories letter, which was quite lengthy and excerpts of which we quote below, was submitted by a Mr. Edward John F. at the time 475 Fell Street, San Francisco, California. Quote, Sirs, I have enjoyed your stories for many years as I have read Amazing since the first issue back in 1928 if I remember right. I think I can show you an entrance to this subterranean city that he, Shaver, has written about several issues back. Here is what happened to me and you may judge for yourself. In 1931 my mother and I took up a section of land as a cattle-raising homestead from the United States government, and naturally it was not a choice piece. A person who turned out to be our nearest neighbor gave us some hints, and as the place was only 6 miles from his we stayed at his ranch until we built our house. Then we moved into our own, and all in all we stayed there about 2 years before we quit. And now I will relate the things that caused us to quit, which at the time I did not know much about, but since Mr. Shaver wrote, now I know and marvel that we managed to stand 2 years without getting killed by these things from below. As a note of interest, I have had to use 30,000 rounds of ammunition in the period, and perhaps that is why we are still here. At night I would sit up fully dressed all night with a rifle in my hands, ready, and an extra one by my side. In about 5 hours after dark I would hear things moving outside the house, and after a while something would try to open the door quietly and I would wait until I saw the knob turn, then let go a clip right through the door, and then pull it open and look around outside, and there was nothing to be seen. After a couple of nights like that performance would stop and something new would be tried. There are too many incidents to be told in one letter. The best one was the 2 disappearing automobiles, which happened at about 10 at night over at the neighbor's place. It was as follows. The neighbor and we were sitting on the porch after supper when he saw headlights come over the hill to the fence, then along the fence for about half a mile, then go out, and that was all that night. So next morning we went to the trail along the fence, and there were tire tracks of 7-inch width tires, and they went along the fence into the box canyon and right up against a smooth boulder about 20 feet in diameter and ended there. Now the car could not turn around anywhere in that place because the road is a trail 5 feet wide and one side is against our neighbor's fence, which was not damaged, and the other was a steep hill that no car could even make in compound low. You know, we have a few mountains here. And as far as backing out, I tried that myself in the daytime with help, and I could not steer a straight enough path without crossing my other marks, so they did not back out, or we would have trailed them, as my neighbor has lived around there since 1848 and he sure knew his tracking. We never did get an answer to the question of where did the cars go. The cars were very large and black and very heavy, and now that I compare them, they were about 20 years ahead of anything I have ever seen anywhere, and I had worked in the auto business for about 5 years before we took up the land. They were silent, smooth, no wavering of the lights, and the trail is extremely rough. In places it is hollows a yard deep, but these cars went through at about 25 miles per hour, and it would even wreck a Jeep to do that, so you figure it out and let me know the answer if you can. By wavering of lights, I mean that the beams were steady and not flashing up and down as an ordinary car would do when a rough road is traveled. I have been away from there since 1933, but just about 3 months ago, I drove through with a friend for safety, and my place is razed to the ground, and everything that was made by human hands has been carried off, even the old tin cans. And the place would not be noticed unless you knew where it was. The Coast and Geodetic Survey had a marker near my house in the front yard, and even that is gone. Who would want to take a concrete marker and carry it away?